The night Elias Carter stood in front of 500 people and chose another woman over his pregnant wife, he believed he was untouchable. He believed Naomi Brooks had no power, no money, no future, nothing but the child in her belly that he no longer wanted. He was wrong about all of it, because the man who pulled Naomi bleeding from the gutter that night wasn't a doctor, wasn't a neighbor, wasn't anyone Elias Carter would ever dare to cross. And by the time Elias understood what he had set in motion, it was already too late to stop it. If this story hits you somewhere deep, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this is only the beginning. The Whitmore Grand Ballroom had been constructed to make people feel small. That was the honest truth of it. Even if the architects and the event planners and the donors who funded these charity galas would never say it aloud. The ceilings climbed 4 stories above the marble floor, hung with chandeliers that cost more than most families earned in a decade, and the whole room glittered with the kind of deliberate excess that was supposed to signal generosity but mostly just announced power. Who had it? Who didn't? Where you stood in the order of things. Naomi Brooks, Naomi Carter, legally for 3 years now, stood near the east wall with a glass of sparkling water she hadn't touched and watched her husband work the room. He was good at it. That was the thing about Elias. Nobody warned you about until it was too late. He was exceptionally, effortlessly good at making you feel like the most important person in any room, right up until the moment he needed someone more important to notice him. And then you ceased to exist so completely, it left a physical ache behind your sternum, like a tooth pulled without anesthetic. She was 7 months pregnant. The black dress she wore had been altered twice in the last 6 weeks and still pulled tight across her abdomen in a way that she couldn't stop being conscious of. Her feet had been swelling since noon, the back of her neck was damp beneath her braids, and she had been standing for 2 hours because every chair in the immediate vicinity had been claimed by someone whose net worth made sitting a privilege. Elias hadn't looked at her in 40 minutes. She watched him cross the floor toward the bar and felt the familiar calculation run through her. Whether to follow, whether to give him space, whether her presence would embarrass him, or whether her absence would make it worse, and hated herself for still doing the math. 3 years of marriage and the math never stopped. It just got more complicated. She started moving toward him anyway. Old habit, the kind that lived in your legs instead of your brain. She was 12 feet away when she saw the woman. The woman was standing near the bar with a champagne flute and a kind of practiced stillness that announced she had been waiting for exactly this moment and had been willing to wait as long as it took. She was tall, ivory-skinned, with dark hair swept up in a way that looked effortless and had certainly taken 90 minutes. She wore a red dress that made every other woman in the room look like she'd gotten dressed in the dark. She was looking at Elias with the specific expression of a person who knows exactly what she wants and has already been promised she'll get it. Elias reached her and didn't look around first. That was the detail Naomi's brain snagged on and wouldn't release. He didn't look around first. He didn't check whether his wife was watching. He reached the woman in the red dress and put his hand on her lower back and leaned in close enough that his mouth brushed her ear, and the woman laughed, and Elias smiled. And the smile was the one Naomi remembered from their first year together, the one she hadn't seen in 18 months. Naomi stopped walking. The water glass was cold in her hand. Condensation ran down her fingers. Around her, the ballroom continued. Conversations and laughter, and the clink of crystal, and a string quartet playing something measured and relentless in the far corner. And none of it touched her. She stood in the middle of it, like a stone in a river. She told herself to breathe. She breathed. She crossed the floor. She stopped 2 feet from them and said, "Elias." He turned. The smile didn't fall. It shifted, rearranged itself into something cooler and more deliberate, the way a man shifts his posture when he's been caught doing something and has already decided denial isn't worth the energy. "Naomi," he said, "I thought you were sitting down." "I was standing." She looked at the woman in the red dress. "You should introduce me." There was a half-second of silence. The woman in the red dress had the decency to look at her champagne flute. Elias said, "This is Serena Voss. She runs the Voss Foundation. They're one of our major donors for the Children's Literacy Initiative." "Serena Voss," Naomi repeated. She kept her voice even. She had gotten very good at keeping her voice even. "Nice to meet you." Serena looked up. She had gray eyes, the kind that photographed beautifully and in person felt like looking at something with no depth behind them. "You too," she said, and her voice was perfectly pleasant and completely without remorse, which told Naomi everything she needed to know about how long this had been going on and how fully the woman had convinced herself that none of it was her fault. Naomi looked back at her husband. "Can I speak with you for a moment? We're in the middle of something." "I understand that. I'm asking for a moment." Elias's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He said to Serena, "Excuse me," and the hand on her lower back dropped, and he moved 2 feet to his left and stopped, which was not the same as moving somewhere private, but was apparently what Naomi was going to get. "What is it?" he said. "What is it?" She repeated it without inflection, which was something she did when she needed time to figure out whether she was angry or devastated and hadn't landed on either yet. "My back has been cramping since 7 o'clock. I'd like to go home. The evening ends at 11. I'm 7 months pregnant, Elias." "I'm aware of that." "Then you understand why I—" "Take the car. I'll get a ride." She looked at him. The ballroom noise pressed against her from all sides. The chandelier light was too bright, too gold. It turned everything slightly wrong. She said very quietly, "With Serena Voss?" Elias held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, "Don't make a scene." "I'm not making a scene. I'm standing here talking to my husband." "Lower your voice." "I'm not raising my voice." She was right. She wasn't. She was speaking at near conversational volume, and every word felt like it was being extracted from somewhere painful in the center of her chest. "I'm asking you a direct question. Are you taking that woman home tonight?" The pause was brief. Elias had never been good at the pauses, at understanding that silence was its own kind of answer, and often the loudest one. He said, "This isn't the place." "Then tell me there's a place. Tell me there's a time when we're going to have this conversation, Elias. Because I've been waiting for you to have it with me for 8 months, and you keep telling me it's not the time." "Naomi, are you in love with her?" The string quartet kept playing. Someone laughed loudly near the entrance, and the sound knifed across the room and dissolved. Elias looked past her left shoulder for a moment, checking the room, cataloging who was close enough to hear, and that single gesture, that involuntary scan for audience and consequence, cracked something open in Naomi's chest that she was not sure could be properly closed again. He looked back at her. "I want a divorce," he said. He said it at the same volume she'd been using, measured, businesslike, as if it were something they'd already discussed, and this was just a confirmation of terms. "I've had the papers drawn up. I'll have them sent to you this week." The water glass was still in her hand. The condensation had soaked into her palm. She was aware of the weight of her son in her abdomen. 7 months of him, real and heavy, and utterly unaware of what was happening above him. And she was aware of Elias's face, familiar and strange, the face she'd looked at across breakfast for 3 years. And she was aware that approximately 40 people in her immediate vicinity had gone quiet in the particular way people go quiet when they understand that something significant and possibly humiliating is occurring nearby, and they are trying to watch without appearing to watch. She said, "You're doing this here. You asked me a direct question. You wanted a direct answer. I'm 7 months pregnant with your—" "The papers will explain my position," he said, "on all of it." She heard the weight in that last sentence, on all of it. She looked at him and she saw something she hadn't expected. Not cruelty exactly, because Elias Carter wasn't a cruel man in the theatrical sense. He was something more clinical than that, something that had decided a long time ago that other people's pain was a logistical problem rather than a moral one. He had already solved the equation in his head. She was the remainder. She set the water glass down on a passing server's tray. Her hand was steady. She was proud of that. In the dim, distant way you could be proud of something when the larger part of your mind was absorbing catastrophic information and trying to figure out if it was real. She said, "Okay." Then she turned around and walked toward the exit. She did not look back. She could feel the room watching her, the turned heads, the murmured consultations, the performance of not staring that was its own form of staring, and she walked through all of it with her back straight and her jaw set and her hand pressed flat against her abdomen where her son shifted and kicked once, as if he knew, as if even he understood that the ground had just moved and nothing was going to be the same on the other side of this night. The coat check line was 3 people deep. She stood in it and breathed, in and out. The cramps in her back pulsed slow and consistent, and she told herself they were nothing, the same way she had been telling herself various things were nothing for 8 months. She collected her coat, she went through the lobby, the doorman held the door and she said thank you because she had been raised to say thank you. Then she was outside. The night was cold and clear, and the city noise came at her all at once after the muffled luxury of the Whitmore Grand. Traffic, a distant siren, the particular white noise of 10,000 lives happening simultaneously in every direction. She stood on the top step and looked at the street below and breathed the cold air and let it hit the back of her throat and tried to decide if she was going to fall apart right now or later. She decided later. She started down the steps. She had her phone out and was opening the car app when the cramp hit. Not the dull background throb of the last few hours, but something sharper and lower, a clench that took her breath and made her stop on the second-to-last step and press her free hand to her side. It passed in 6 seconds. She exhaled slowly and told herself it was nothing. Stress, tension, the body registering what the mind was working to suppress. She made it to the sidewalk. She stepped past a group of smokers in evening wear and rounded the corner onto the side street where the pickup zone was. Quieter here, darker, the ballroom noise already muted behind the building's corner. She didn't hear the man behind her until he was close enough that his breath touched the back of her neck. She spun. Her elbow went up, reflexive, a habit she'd built from years of navigating cities alone at night. But it didn't matter because there were 2 of them, not one, and the second one was already coming from her left. And the one on her right caught her wrist and wrenched it, and she heard herself cry out, sharp and involuntary, and her phone hit the pavement. "Don't," the one on the right said. His voice was flat, professional. This was not random. That was the thought that cut cleanest through the noise. This is not random. Don't scream, don't fight, and this stays simple. What do you want? She was trying to keep her voice level. She was failing. We're not interested in your purse. The one on the left had her other arm now. She could feel the bulk of him, the way he angled her body against the wall without quite slamming her into it. Controlled, practiced. Someone who'd done this before and understood the difference between pressure that controlled and pressure that left marks that told stories. The cramp hit again, and she couldn't suppress the sound she made, which was small and tight, and the man on her right looked at her stomach and something passed across his face that was not quite humanity but was adjacent to it. "Take it easy," he said, and there was almost something that could have been read as consideration in it, which was the most terrifying part. "I'm pregnant." The words came out rough. "Whatever you want, I'm 7 months pregnant, please." "We know," the one on the left said. "We know." Those 2 words. She stopped pulling against their grip. Her mind went very clear and very cold. They knew. This wasn't random chance, and they weren't strangers who'd picked her out of a crowd. Someone had sent them. And the list of people who knew where she would be tonight and might want to use her as leverage was not a long list, and at the top of it was a man who had just told her calmly, in a room full of people, that he wanted a divorce and that the papers would explain his position on all of it. "Elias," she said. It wasn't a question. Neither of them answered. She twisted hard to the left. Pure panic, not strategy. And the grip on her right wrist yanked her back and she went down on one knee on the pavement, and the impact sent a bolt of pain up through her hip and thigh. And she felt something wrong in her abdomen. A tightening that was deeper and more alarming than anything she'd felt tonight, and she pressed her hand against her stomach and said her son's name in her head without meaning to. The name she hadn't even settled on yet, the name that existed only as a maybe, a placeholder for a future she'd been building and was now watching get dismantled from multiple directions simultaneously. The man on the left was pulling her up. She was trying to get her feet under her. Her phone was on the ground 3 feet away, screen cracked, and she could see the map application still open, the blinking dot of her location like a tiny signal fire that no one was watching. Then there was a sound. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the particular sound of something heavy and solid making contact with a skull, precise, and economical, and the man on her left made no sound at all before he dropped. She stumbled sideways with the sudden loss of his grip and nearly fell again, caught herself against the wall, and turned. The man on the right was already moving, turning toward the new threat, but he didn't have time to finish the turn. There was a second impact, this one lower and faster, and he went down onto his knees and then flat and didn't get up. The street was quiet. A figure stood 6 feet away in the shadow between two parked cars. He was tall, not conspicuously, but the kind of tall that arranged a body into something that took up space with authority rather than accident. Dark coat, dark everything. His face was in partial shadow, but she could see the line of a jaw that looked like it had been set hard and kept that way, and eyes that were scanning the street before he looked at her, checking the perimeter before he looked at the thing the perimeter was meant to protect. He did this in 3 seconds. Then he looked at her. He said, "Can you walk?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What happened?" Not any of the soft focus things a stranger says when they want to be reassuring. He said, "Can you walk?" And the directness of it, the absolute lack of performance in it, was so different from everything that had happened in the last 2 hours that it almost undid her. "Yes," she said. "Your phone." He moved past her without touching her, picked up the cracked phone from the pavement, and handed it to her. She took it. Their fingers didn't quite touch. Another cramp hit, and this time it was bad enough that she couldn't hold her expression, and her hand went to her abdomen automatically, and she heard herself make a sound that was not crying, but was close enough to its cousin that the man in front of her registered it immediately. He looked at her stomach, back at her face. He said, "How far along?" 7 months. Something shifted in his expression. Not softening exactly, more like recalibration, an equation reconsidered. He said, "There's a car at the end of the block. I have a doctor on call." "I don't know you." "No," he said. He didn't say it dismissively. He said it the way you acknowledge a fact that is both true and, at this particular moment, somewhat beside the point. "You don't." She looked at the 2 men on the ground. One of them was breathing in the thick, unconscious way of someone who would wake up with a headache and different problems than he'd started the evening with. The other one was starting to stir. She looked at the man in the dark coat. She had nothing. Her marriage was gone. Her phone was cracked. She was 7 months pregnant on a dark side street, and her body was doing things that scared her, and there were 2 men on the pavement who had known her name and had been sent for her specifically. She had nothing and she had no one, and the only thing standing between her and the next thing that might find her in the dark was this stranger who had said, "Can you walk?" Like the answer was the only information that mattered. "Yes," she said again. "I can walk." He turned and walked toward the end of the block. She followed. The cramp in her abdomen was a knot now, tight and insistent, and she pressed her palm against her son and kept walking. Boots. The car was black, long, unmarked. The driver didn't turn around when they got in. The man in the dark coat sat opposite her. There was a partition open between the front and back, and pulled out a phone and made a call that lasted 11 seconds and consisted almost entirely of an address, and the words, "Make sure Dr. Reyes is there." He ended the call. He looked at her. She was sitting with her back straight because if she let herself relax, she was not sure she would be able to keep the structural integrity of herself together, and she needed to stay intact. She needed to stay functional. She needed to stay present enough to make decisions because the luxury of falling apart was not something the night schedule appeared to accommodate. "What's your name?" he said. "Naomi." "Naomi." He said it like he was putting it somewhere. "I'm Damien." She looked at him properly for the first time in good light. He was in his late 30s, maybe early 40s. Dark hair, close cut. A face that had been handsome once and was now something more than handsome and less than comfortable. The kind of face that had lived in high-pressure environments long enough that it had been rearranged by them. There was a scar that started at the left corner of his jaw and ran maybe 2 inches toward his ear, old enough to be silver white against his skin, recent enough that she put it within the last 10 years. His hands rested on his knees. She could see that his right knuckle was split, fresh. He'd gotten that in the last 5 minutes, doing what he'd done in the alley to the man who'd had her arm. She said, "You're not a good Samaritan." "No," he agreed. "Those men. You knew what you were doing." "Yes." "Who are you?" He looked at her for a moment. The car was moving now, quiet and smooth through the city grid, and the lights of storefronts and street lamps moved across the windows in horizontal strips. He said, "The kind of man those two were afraid of." She should have been more afraid than she was. The logical part of her brain, the part that was still functioning on something approaching normal parameters, was registering the data and producing reasonable concern. Unknown man, unregistered vehicle, destination unconfirmed, 2 men unconscious in an alley. The logical part of her brain was saying this is not automatically better. But there was another part, the part that had been in that ballroom for 2 hours, the part that had heard the word divorce delivered in a boardroom voice while 500 people pretended not to listen. The part that had felt 2 sets of hands close around her wrists and understood, with the terrible clarity of a woman who has been underestimated her entire life, that the man she had married had decided she was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be reckoned with. That part of her was not afraid of Damien. That part of her was looking at a man who had walked into a dark alley and put 2 men on the ground in under 10 seconds because someone needed it done, and was thinking, at least this one is honest about what he is. She said, "Where are you taking me?" "Somewhere safe." "That's not specific." "No," he said again, and there was something in the repetition. He had a quality of saying no the same way every time, without apology or qualification, like someone who had decided long ago that no was a complete sentence. It isn't. She looked out the window. The city scrolled past. She put her hand on her abdomen, and her son pressed back against it, that small, insistent pressure that had become, over 7 months, the most reliable thing in her life. She didn't know this man. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know what the papers Elias had drawn up were going to say, explain my position on all of it. And she didn't know what that position was going to mean for her son, for the apartment she'd have to leave, for the life she had built inside a marriage that had apparently been hollow at its center for longer than she'd understood. She knew one thing. She knew the cramp in her side had gotten worse in the last 10 minutes, and she knew that whatever her body was doing, it was doing it whether she was in this car or back on that sidewalk, and she needed medical attention, and she needed it from someone who was not going to ask her to explain why she was 7 months pregnant and alone outside a charity gala at 11 o'clock at night. "Okay," she said, for the second time that night. The word felt different this time. The first time she'd said it to Elias, it had been a closing, a door shut, a thing ended. This time it felt like the opposite, like the first word of something, though she had no idea yet what. She settled back in the seat and kept her hand on her son and watched the city pass outside the glass. And somewhere in the back of her mind, underneath the fear and the grief and the low rolling alarm of a body telling her something was wrong, she filed away a single detail. The men in the alley had been afraid. She had seen it in the second before Damien put the first one down. That recognition, that flash of something that was not surprise but was terror, the specific terror of a person who has been expecting to avoid a consequence and has suddenly run directly into it. Those men had been sent by someone with power, and they had looked at Damien Moretti and been afraid, which meant whatever else he was, whoever this man in the dark coat was, whatever he'd built, whatever history lived in that scar along his jaw, he was something that men with power were afraid of. She didn't know, sitting in that car with her cracked phone and her son pressing against her palm, whether that was the best piece of news she'd received all night or the worst. She would have time to decide. What she didn't have was the luxury of standing still long enough to be afraid of the question. What? The estate was 40 minutes north of the city. She didn't see it clearly when they arrived because it was past midnight and the drive-up was tree-lined and the darkness was absolute. But she registered the gate. Iron, heavy, the kind that didn't open by sensor but required a code and a second confirmation. And the guards at the perimeter, 2 of them visible and certainly more that weren't, and the particular silence of a place that was large enough and secure enough that the ordinary sounds of the world hadn't penetrated it. The doctor was already there. Dr. Reyes was a compact woman in her 50s with close-cropped silver hair and the unhurried competence of someone who had been pulled from bed at midnight before and found it occupationally unremarkable. She met them at the entrance and had Naomi assessed in a ground floor room that had been set up with disconcerting thoroughness as something close to a medical suite, portable ultrasound, IV supplies, medications that suggested someone had anticipated a range of emergencies and stocked accordingly. Naomi lay on the examination table and let the doctor work and looked at the ceiling, which was plain plaster, not elaborate, nothing like the chandeliers of the Whitmore Grand, and felt the gap between the two environments as a physical thing, the remove of those few hours, the distance between the woman who had stood holding a glass of sparkling water and watched her husband choose someone else, and the woman lying on this table while a stranger pressed a transducer against her abdomen and read the information her body was generating. "Your son is fine," Dr. Reyes said. She said it without preamble, which Naomi appreciated. "Heartbeat is strong. He's positioned well. What you're feeling is Braxton Hicks exacerbated by stress and physical strain. You went down on that knee hard?" "Yes. Some bruising on the hip, nothing structural." She looked at Naomi over the edge of the portable screen. "What happened?" "It was a long night." Dr. Reyes looked at her for a moment. She was the kind of doctor who had learned to read the subtext of "it was a long night" and understood when pressing would help and when it wouldn't. She said, "You need to rest. Hydration, horizontal position, no more standing events in the near future." She paused. "I'm going to tell him the same thing. You don't need to explain my situation to him. I'm going to tell him you need rest and stability, not details." A slight shift of expression that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it. "He's particular about details. He'll listen to the facts." Naomi didn't ask what that meant. She filed it away in the same place she'd filed the fear in the alley. They gave her a room on the second floor. It was not lavish in the way she might have expected from an estate this size. It was clean, simply furnished, the bed substantial and made with military precision. There were clothes in the dresser, her size approximately. She registered this and didn't pursue it, not tonight. The implications of a guest room stocked with women's clothing in her approximate size was information she would process when she was not concussed by grief and running on stress hormones. There was a bolt on the inside of the door. She used it. She lay on the bed with her hand on her son and looked at the ceiling of this unknown room in this unknown house belonging to a man named Damien, who had put two men on the ground in 11 seconds and then handed her her phone and said, "Can you walk?" like it was the only question that mattered. She thought about Elias, about the papers he'd drawn up, about the phrase "my position on all of it," about what all of it encompassed, about the fact that the men in the alley had known she was pregnant, had known where she would be, had been calm and professional and deliberate, and had said "we know" when she'd offered her pregnancy as a reason for mercy, which meant the pregnancy was known, was factored in, was apparently not a deterrent. What kind of man sends people after his 7 months pregnant wife? She thought she'd known Elias. She had believed, even in the worst of the last year, the distance, the coldness, the gradual withdrawal that she'd told herself was work stress, and told herself was just marriage settling, and told herself was something they could repair. She had believed she knew the outermost shape of who he was. Ambitious, compartmentalizing, uncomfortable with dependency, with need, with anything that couldn't be reduced to a negotiation with a defined outcome. But she had believed there was a floor, a level below which he would not go. She understood now that she had been wrong about the floor. Her son kicked, sharp, decisive, like a punctuation mark, and she pressed her palm against it and held it there. "I know," she said to the dark room. "I know." She didn't sleep for a long time. When she finally did, it was close to 4 in the morning, and the house around her was silent, except for the occasional footfall somewhere below. Measured, even, someone walking a pattern. And she understood somewhere in the half-dissolved place between waking and sleep that the pattern was deliberate, that someone was keeping watch. She didn't know if that should frighten her. She was too tired to decide. She slept. In the morning, she found him in a room she located by following the smell of coffee through 2 corridors and down a half-flight of stairs. It was a kind of study kitchen combination. A large table covered in papers and a laptop open to something she didn't have time to read before the screen closed. And Damien was standing at the counter with a cup of coffee and a phone pressed to his ear, speaking in a low, precise voice in what she thought was Italian but might have been something else, and he stopped speaking when she appeared in the doorway. He said something brief into the phone and ended the call. He looked at her. "How do you take it?" "Black," she said, and then immediately felt that that was the wrong level of ease with the situation. Like she was establishing herself as comfortable in a place she didn't yet understand, but she was also too tired to perform uncertainty she'd have to maintain. He poured her a cup. She sat at the end of the large table because her feet were still sore and the chair was there. He remained standing, which she noted. He kept distance. Deliberately, she thought, maintained a physical margin that wasn't coldness but was something more like restraint. She said, "I need to ask you something." "Go ahead." "Last night, those men." She cupped both hands around the coffee mug. "Did you send them away or did you call someone else? And what happens to them now?" He looked at her for a moment. She had the impression he was calibrating, deciding how much of an honest answer she actually wanted. He said, "They've been contained." "Contained? They won't bother you again." "That's not what I asked." He set his own cup down. He said, "No, it isn't." A pause. Not hesitation, more like a man choosing exactly which door to open. "They'll be used for information. Who sent them and why? After that?" He shrugged, a small economical movement. "They stopped being relevant to me when they let you go." She thought about what stopped being relevant meant in the vocabulary of a man like this. She thought she might have an approximate translation, and she filed it without comment. She said, "My husband sent them." "I know." She looked up from the coffee. "You know." Elias Carter, Carter Technologies. The divorce filing was submitted this morning, 2 hours ago. Electronically. He picked up his cup again. His voice was the same throughout. Not detached exactly, but uninflected, information delivered without the editorial overlay most people couldn't resist. "The filing contains a paternity challenge." The bottom dropped out of the room. Naomi held very still. She said, "What?" "He's claiming the child isn't his." The words hit her in sequence, each one slightly delayed, the meaning of them arriving in waves rather than all at once. Paternity challenge. He was claiming, "That's not—" She stopped. Her voice had gone unsteady somewhere in the middle of that sentence, and she needed it back before she continued. She set the coffee down. She pressed both palms flat on the table surface. The grain of the wood under her fingers, something solid and real. "That's not true." Damien was looking at her with an expression that was careful rather than skeptical. He said, "I understand." "He's lying. She breathed. "He's doing it to reduce the settlement, to complicate the custody. He knows that if he can establish doubt, then it becomes a different kind of proceeding, and he—" She stopped again. The calculation was so clinical, so deliberate. The divorce announcement in a room full of people to humiliate her publicly, the men in the alley to frighten her into compliance, and now this, a legal maneuver designed to strip her son of his identity before he was even born. "He planned this," she said. "All of it. He planned—" "Yes," Damien said. She looked at him. He was watching her with those eyes that processed and cataloged and gave very little back in return. She said, "Why do you care? Why am I here? Why did you—" She gestured at the room, the house, the impossible fact of where she was sitting. "You don't know me. You picked me up off a sidewalk." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee cup. Something moved across his face that was brief and difficult to read. Not discomfort exactly, more like a man coming up against a question he had been considering since last night and had not quite resolved. He said, "I knew your maiden name, Brooks. I recognized it when you said it." She frowned. "How?" He looked at her. "My mother's name was Elena Moretti. She worked at a fertility clinic in the city. 14 years ago. She was involved in an irregularity, a serious one." He paused. "Her records were sealed when she died. I've been looking for them for 3 years." She stared at him. Something was moving at the edge of her comprehension, a shape she could almost see but not yet. She said, "What kind of irregularity?" Damien said, "The kind that changes who people are to each other." The morning light came through the window at a low angle and fell across the table between them. Her son shifted inside her. that small, certain, definitive weight. She looked down at her hand, still flat on the table, and then back up at this man she had known for less than 12 hours, who had pulled her out of an alley and stocked a guest room and had a doctor on call and was now looking at her with an expression that was not quite certainty but was past the point of coincidence. She said, "What are you telling me?" Damien held her gaze. His voice didn't waver and he didn't look away. He said, "I'm telling you that I think there may be a reason those records matter to both of us. And I think it's the same reason." The coffee had gone cold in her hands. Outside the window, somewhere on the estate grounds, a bird called once and went silent. The morning held, and somewhere beneath the grief and the fear and the exhaustion of a night that had unmade her life and remade it in shapes she didn't yet recognize, Naomi Brooks felt something she hadn't felt since she'd stood in that ballroom and watched her husband choose someone else. She felt a question, a real one. Not the exhausted, circular questions of a failing marriage, but something sharp and forward-facing, something that pointed at tomorrow rather than last night. She said, "Show me the records." Damien crossed the room to a steel cabinet built flush with the wall. She hadn't noticed it, had taken it for a section of paneling, and unlocked it with a key he wore on a chain under his shirt. He pulled out a file. Not thick. Maybe 30 pages, bound with a metal clip, the corners of the paper gone soft with age and handling. He set it on the table in front of her and stepped back. He didn't sit. He stood at the counter and gave her the distance and said nothing. She opened it. The first page was a clinic intake form. 14 years old, the date printed in faded ink in the upper right corner. The clinic's name was Meridian Fertility Associates, an address in the financial district that she didn't recognize, and the patient name at the top was a name she did recognize because it was her mother's. Diane Brooks. She stopped breathing for a moment. Just a moment, one missed beat, and then her lungs corrected and she turned to the next page and read. It took her 12 minutes to get through all of it. She was a careful reader, and these were careful documents. Clinical language, coded references, the particular bureaucratic architecture of something that was trying to describe wrongdoing without using the word. But the shape of it emerged clearly enough through the abstraction. A fertility clinic, a series of procedures, a physician named Doctor. Elena Moretti, who had, according to the internal review notes clipped to the back of the file, deviated from standard protocol in the processing of donor samples. Not once, not accidentally, but systematically, over a period of 2 years, in a manner that the review board described as deliberate, and the word deliberate was underlined in pencil, someone's emphasis, someone who had read this document and wanted to make sure that word did not get overlooked. She closed the file. She put both hands flat on it, like she was trying to hold it down. She said, "Your mother switched the samples." "Yes." She replaced the donor material with... She stopped. The sentence had an end that her mouth was unwilling to finish. She looked up at him. "With what?" "Whose?" He said, "My father's." The room was very quiet. The morning light had shifted in the last 12 minutes, moved incrementally across the floor. Somewhere outside, a vehicle was pulling up the drive. She heard gravel, then silence. Damien heard it too, but didn't move. His attention remained on her, steady and without performance. She said, "Your father, Marcus Moretti. He was a patient at the clinic, different procedure, different department. The samples were cataloged in the same facility." He picked up his coffee cup again, set it down without drinking. "My mother believed she was doing something corrective. She thought my father had a right to biological children he didn't know he was being denied, by a different set of choices someone else had made for him." He paused. "She was wrong. The method was wrong. But that was the reasoning, as best I've been able to reconstruct it." The reasoning. Naomi heard her own voice like it was coming from a different room. "She made that choice for my mother, for me, for whoever was born from those procedures, without consent, without..." She stopped. There was too much in the sentence to finish any single branch of it. She looked at the file under her hands. "How many?" 3 procedures over 2 years. I've confirmed 2 resulting pregnancies." He looked at her. "I've been looking for the second one for 3 years. The records were sealed when she died. A car accident 8 years ago. And the clinic shut down 2 years after that. The paper trail was buried. But you found it. I found most of it. A pause. I found you last night. She sat with that. The word found and all the weight it was carrying. She sat with the fact that she was 7 months pregnant, and the man whose mother had engineered her conception was standing 8 feet away from her in a kitchen on an estate outside the city, and that nothing about this situation had any precedent in her experience of how lives were supposed to work. She said, "You're not certain." "No, not without a test." "But you think," "I think the timing matches. I think the clinic records match. And I think—" He stopped. For the first time, something in his expression moved that wasn't calculation or restraint. Something that was harder to name and looked more expensive. "I think my father died not knowing he had a grandchild coming, and I would like to know whether that's true before the child is born." She looked at him for a long time. He held the look without flinching, without filling the silence, which was, she was starting to understand, the most characteristic thing about him. He didn't perform. He didn't manage her reactions. He said the thing, and then he waited, and the waiting was its own kind of honesty. She said, "I need a lawyer." "I have 3. I need my own lawyer." Something almost crossed into a smile. It didn't fully arrive, but it passed close enough that she saw the shape of it. "I'll get you a list." She nodded. She looked down at the file again. Her son moved. Not a kick this time, a slow roll, the kind of movement that felt like stretching, like something trying to find more room. She pressed her palm against her side automatically and stayed like that for a moment, her hand on her son who might be more to the man across the room than either of them had known 2 days ago. She said, "I'm not making any decisions about any of this until I know my son is safe, until I understand what Elias is actually filing and what it means." Reasonable. "I'm not agreeing to anything, not about the test, not about whatever this," she gestured between the two of them, "is supposed to be. I'm saying I'm here until I have somewhere else to be that's safer. That's all?" "That's all I offered," he said. Not defensive, just precise. She nodded once. She stood up, picked up the file, and held it out to him. He took it. Their fingers didn't touch this time either. She said, "Thank you for the coffee." She walked out. But she learned the house in sections over the next 3 days. It was larger than she'd initially understood, 5 levels if you counted the basement, which she didn't go near, and a wing on the east side that was access controlled in a way that made it clear it was not for her. The grounds ran to about 12 acres, she estimated, though she couldn't see the full perimeter from any window. There were guards she didn't see, and guards she did. The visible ones positioned at the gate and the main entrance, and at least one walking rotation around the east side of the building. She established a routine because routine was the only architecture that made the days feel real. Morning, coffee, slow circuit of the first floor, an hour in the ground floor library, which was lined wall to wall with books that had actually been read. Spines creased, pages dog-eared, some with handwriting in the margins. She didn't look too closely at the handwriting. Afternoon, a chair by the south-facing window in the sitting room where the light was good, and she could call her sister Brianna and speak in careful general terms about her situation, while Brianna asked increasingly direct questions that Naomi deflected with increasing skill. Brianna called on the 3rd afternoon, and this time Naomi let it go longer than she should have. "I'm looking at the filing, Nay." Brianna's voice was the kind of tight that meant she had been sitting on something for days and had run out of room. "I'm looking at the actual document, and I need you to tell me straight. Did Elias tell you before you saw this in the press? Because it's in the press now. The paternity challenge. Someone leaked it." Naomi closed her eyes. "When?" "This morning. There's a gossip column and 3 business outlets. They're framing it as Carter Technologies CEO disputes paternity amid sudden marriage collapse. Somebody fed them the timing and the details, Nay. This wasn't accidental." "No," she said. "It wasn't." "Where are you? You've been telling me you're staying with a friend, and I'm calling the bluff because I know your friends, and none of them have a number that goes straight to voicemail, and I'm safe." "That's not what I asked." "Brianna?" She opened her eyes and looked at the window, the pale winter light of the grounds, a guard she could see at the east corner moving in his pattern. "I know you're scared. I am too. But I cannot tell you where I am right now, and I need you to trust that there is a reason for that." Give me one reason, one real one. Because the men Elias sent to get me from outside the Whitmore knew I was pregnant and were not deterred by it. A silence. Then, Naomi. I'm safe. My son is fine. I have a doctor. And I have... She stopped. How to categorize Damien Moretti in a sentence to her sister. I have protection, but the less you know about the specifics, the better right now, and I need you to get me a lawyer, not through anyone connected to Elias. Find someone through Dad's old colleague at Hargrove and Partners, the one he trusted with the estate. Raymond Fitch. Yes. Tell him I need family law, and I need it now, and it needs to be airtight, and I need someone who doesn't flinch. A pause. Brianna was processing. Naomi could hear her breathing shift, the in through the nose that meant her sister was swallowing panic and replacing it with something functional. Okay, she said. Okay. I'll call Raymond today. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I'm still furious with you for being wherever you are with whoever you're with and not telling me. I know. I want to meet him. Naomi blinked. I didn't say it was a him. A short silence on the other end that was its own answer. Brianna said, just be careful, and ended the call. Aret. On the fourth day, Damien's lieutenant came to find her. She'd seen him before. A compact, dark-eyed man in his mid-30s named Leo, who moved with the quiet efficiency of someone whose job it was to be in the right place before anyone asked, and whose expression operated on a narrow register between neutral and watchful. He appeared in the library doorway at 11 in the morning while she was attempting to read a novel, and mostly rereading the same paragraph. He said, "There's been a development. Damien would like you to hear it directly." She closed the book. She followed him to the office on the second floor, the one she'd understood from her first full day of the house was the real center of operations. Not the study with the kitchen table, but this room, which had 3 screens running on one wall and a large table covered in the organized evidence of multiple ongoing things. Maps, photographs, printed documents with margin notes in the same handwriting she'd glimpsed in the library. She wondered if she should know that the library and the war room had the same handwriting, and then decided yes, she should probably know that. Damien was standing at the table. He didn't look up immediately when she came in, finished what he was looking at, then turned. He said, "One of the men from the alley gave us information." She stood in the center of the room. Leo had positioned himself near the door, which she noted. What kind of information? Elias didn't contract them directly. He used a third party, a fixer named Vincent Caro, who runs contract work through a legitimate corporate security front. Caro has been on Elias's payroll for 18 months. He picked up a photograph from the table and set it in front of her without requiring her to come closer, keeping it where she could see it from where she stood. A man in his 50s shot from a distance, entering what looked like a parking structure. Caro operates with contractual deniability. Elias can claim he hired him for security consulting, and every record will support that. The instruction chain is verbal, nothing written. So legally untouchable? From that angle, yes. She looked at the photograph. She thought about Elias in the boardroom he used for his Monday calls, the one with the glass wall overlooking the trading floor. Making a call to this man in the parking structure and giving a verbal instruction and then going back to his day. Going back to Serena Voss's apartment or to his office or to wherever he'd spent the night after the gala, and she felt the anger move through her, not hot the way she expected, but cold and precise, the way a fever breaks and leaves something sharp behind. She said, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because it's about you. You should know." "That's not a Damien Moretti reason," she said. She watched something shift in his face. "You've been running an operation longer than 4 days. You knew Elias before the alley. You were already watching something." The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then he said, "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her steadily. Carter Technologies holds significant interests in 3 commercial developments that were financed through channels my organization has been tracking for 2 years. Elias Carter has been moving money through those channels. Specifically, money that belongs to people who are now looking for it. Whose money? A pause. People you don't need to know about specifically, but the short version, Elias has been running a shadow financing structure that used institutional investment as a front. He's been doing it since before you married him. The information landed in the particular way of something that wasn't surprising, but was still devastating. Not the fact itself, but the scope of it. Before she'd married him. Before she'd looked across a table at him and thought she was choosing a life. Before 3 years, and an apartment, and a pregnancy, and every adjustment she'd made in herself to fit inside the shape of that marriage. Before all of it, the man she married had already been doing this, and none of what followed had ever been fully real. She said, "So, dismantling his business empire isn't just about me." "It started before you," he said, which was an honest answer, which she respected more than a strategic one. "But now I'm inside the operation." "You're not inside it, you're adjacent to it. You're a woman he tried to have removed, whose safety I've guaranteed." "Those are different things." "Are they?" He held her gaze. He said, "I'm not going to let what I'm doing to Elias Carter put you in more danger than he's already created for you. That's a line." He said it the way he said most things, without drama, without needing her to believe it emotionally, as if it were simply a fact about the structural engineering of how he operated. Whether you believe that or not is up to you, but it's true. She stood in the center of his war room and looked at the photographs on the table and the screens on the wall and the organized architecture of a man who had been taking apart another man's world for reasons that had preceded her and would, in most ways, continue after her. And she thought, what am I doing inside this house? She thought, my son is safe, my son is healthy, my lawyer is coming. She thought, Elias sent a man named Vincent Caro to manage her removal from her own life. And she was standing in a room that was actively, methodically, without rage, but with something colder than rage. She was standing in a room that was taking that apart piece by piece, and she did not feel she had to apologize to anyone for how that made her feel. She said, "What did Elias's investors find out that made them start to leave?" Damien tilted his head slightly. The closest thing to surprise she'd seen from him. "Why?" "Because you said mysterious investors have been abandoning him. I want to understand what they learned." He looked at her for a moment. Then he moved to the table and turned one of the printed documents to face her. She came forward and read it. It was a financial summary, heavily annotated, tracing a set of fund movements between shell companies across 3 jurisdictions over 18 months. "The Meridian Group," she said, reading the company name at the top. She went still. "Damien." "I know." "Meridian, same as the clinic, Meridian Fertility Associates." "Different company, but the name is not a coincidence." He said it carefully. "My father's money funded both. Marcus Moretti ran a network of small-scale commercial investments before he died. 2 of them, I found out 6 years ago, were put into structures he didn't authorize. Someone used his capital and his name and ran the accounts after his death without proper succession documentation. Elias Carter's financial advisor at the time was the connecting thread." She stared at him. "How far back does this go?" "Far enough," he said, "that when I started pulling it apart, it stopped being just about money." She put her hand on the edge of the table. The document was dense, and she wasn't a financial analyst, but she was smart, and she had 3 years of listening to Elias Carter explain his business at dinner with the half attention of a man who didn't fully believe she was listening. And some of what she'd stored without fully indexing was now sorting itself under the light of this document into coherence. She said, "He knew about your father." "I believe so. Not at the beginning. He inherited the arrangement from people who did know." "And the clinic." "The clinic was my mother's mistake in the middle of all of it. She found something she wasn't supposed to find about what was being done with my father's resources. And she couldn't report it without implicating herself in the sample irregularities. So she buried it and kept working and died 8 years later in a car that went off a rain-wet overpass." He said the last part without inflection, which she understood by now was not coldness, but the opposite. The places where feeling had been compressed to the point of near silence under long pressure. She said, very quietly, "You think it wasn't an accident?" He said nothing, which was its own answer. The room was very still. The 3 screens on the wall cycled through data feeds she couldn't read at a distance. Leo was still at the door, a fixed point, professionally absent from the conversation in the way of a person who has heard this before and understood his role was not to be part of it. Naomi straightened. She put both hands to her back, the low ache that lived there permanently now, the weight of 7 months carried upright. She said, "I want to help." Damien looked at her. His expression was genuinely difficult to read, which meant something was happening in it that he was not fully suppressing. "That's not something I'd ask of you." "I didn't say you asked. I said I want to." She met his eyes. "I was married to him for 3 years. I was in that apartment, in those offices, at those dinners. I watched him work. I watched him manage people, and he didn't watch me watching him because he never once fully believed I was paying attention." She let that sit between them for a moment. "I have a different kind of information than what you have on those screens." A long pause. Damien said, "What kind?" "The personal kind. The kind that doesn't leave paper trails, who he's afraid of, who he actually defers to, what he does when the pressure gets high enough that the performance slips." She held his gaze. "I know the version of Elias Carter that nobody in those documents has ever seen." The room held the silence for several seconds. Then Leo, from the door, without quite looking at either of them, said, "She's right, you know." Damien looked at him. Leo appeared to study the middle distance, professionally unbothered. Damien looked back at Naomi. The calculation was visible. Not calculation of whether to use her, she thought, but calculation of whether using her would put her at more risk, whether the value of the information could be justified against what it might cost, whether he was looking at a woman who understood what she was offering, or one who was running on adrenaline and grief and hadn't fully thought it through. She said, "I've had 4 days to think it through." He said, "You said that like you knew what I was thinking." "I'm getting better at reading the pause." Something moved in his face again. The almost smile that didn't quite arrive. He said, "Elias Carter has a meeting in 3 days. Private off calendar. We know about it because his assistant is an honest woman who doesn't like what her employer has become." He paused. "The meeting is with a man named Gerald Price. Price sits on the board of 3 of the shell companies in that document." "I know Gerald Price," she said immediately. "He and Elias play golf every 3rd Sunday. I had dinner with him and his wife twice. His wife's name is Marie, and she has a thing about being called Mary instead of Marie, and Elias always got it wrong, and it drove Price quietly insane." She stopped. "He has a daughter from a first marriage. Elias knows something about the daughter. I don't know what, but there's a dynamic there. Price defers in a specific way that has nothing to do with business leverage and everything to do with something personal." Damien was still watching her. "Go on," he said. She pulled out the chair across the table from the documents. She sat down. Her son was quiet now, settled into the lower curve of her, and she put one hand on her abdomen and leaned forward and said, "Tell me what you need from the Price connection." And so it began. Not with fanfare, not with any scene she could have anticipated or prepared for. It began with her at a table in a room full of evidence, in a house she hadn't chosen, in a life that had been dismantled and was still resolving into whatever shape it was becoming, and she began to lay out the pieces of 3 years of careful, unconscious observation. And Damien Moretti listened to every word with the focused attention of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time, that the woman sitting across from him was not a liability in his operation. She was an asset he hadn't seen coming. Whilst 2 days later, the call came from Raymond Fitch. She took it in the library, door closed, afternoon light long across the carpet. Raymond Fitch had a voice like weathered timber, solid, slow-paced, the voice of a man who had spent 40 years in courtrooms and had learned that urgency was a performance and precision was a tool. He said, "I've reviewed the filing, Ms. Brooks. It's aggressive. Tell me the worst of it." The paternity challenge is the legal nucleus. If he can establish doubt about the child's biological origin, he restructures the entire divorce framework: custody, support, asset division. He's also filing on grounds of marital misconduct, alleging that you abandoned the marital residence voluntarily, which impacts the property claims. "I didn't abandon it. I left under threat of physical harm." "We'll need to establish that." A pause. "The men in the alley?" "Yes." "Were there witnesses?" "The man who intervened." A longer pause. Raymond Fitch said, "Who is this man?" She looked at the bookshelf in front of her, at the spines of books with pages dog-eared and margins written in. She said, "Someone who was there." "Ms. Brooks, I need to be direct with you. If the person who intervened has a profile that can be weaponized in family court, criminal history, organized crime associations, any federal investigation, Elias Carter's legal team will use his involvement to argue that you have voluntarily placed yourself and your unborn child in a dangerous environment. That reframes the whole." "I understand," she said. "Do you?" She looked at the window. At the guard in his rotation outside, the pale winter sky, the 12 acres she couldn't fully see. She said, "Yes, I understand exactly what it means." She paused. "I need you to work on establishing the credibility of the threat first. The alley, the men, the connection to Caro. If we can prove he sent them, the abandonment argument collapses and the misconduct framing reverses." "That's the right strategy. Do you have access to any documentation connecting the contract to Elias directly?" She thought about the war room on the second floor, about the document she'd been allowed to read and the 3 screens cycling through data, and a man who had been building a case against Elias Carter for 2 years that was about far more than a marriage and a paternity filing. She said, "I may. Get it to me. Whatever you can get me, get it to me." "Yes," she said. She ended the call. She sat for a moment in the afternoon quiet. Then she stood and went upstairs. Damien was at the table in the war room. Leo was there too, and a third person she hadn't met before. A woman in her 30s with short-cut natural hair and the look of someone who processed information faster than she spoke, which was fast. The 3 of them were looking at a set of photographs spread across the table. Naomi stopped in the doorway. She said, "I need the Caro documentation, the contract trail. I need what you have on the connection between Caro and Elias for my lawyer." Damien looked up. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said to Leo, "Pull the Caro summary file." And to the woman, "Give us the room." The woman gathered her materials without comment and left. Leo went to the steel cabinet and pulled a folder and set it on the end of the table and left too. The room was quiet. Damien said, "Sharing this documentation exposes part of how we gathered it." "I know. If it surfaces in court proceedings, it draws scrutiny." "I know," she said again. "I'm asking anyway." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, a single brief movement, and didn't say anything else, which was the fullest version of agreement she was going to get, and she understood that now. She moved to the table and picked up the Caro file and opened it. She was 3 pages in when Leo appeared back in the doorway. Not at a run, but at the specific speed of a man who has received information that requires immediate delivery without creating alarm. He said, "We have a problem." Damien looked up. "Price moved the meeting. It's not in 3 days." Leo looked at Naomi briefly, then back at Damien. "It's tonight, and the location changed. It's not the downtown address. It's the Carter property on the North Shore." A beat. "The one Elias has been using as a secondary residence since the separation." Another beat. "And we just got confirmation that Caro is going to be there." The room went very still. Naomi looked at the file in her hands. She looked at Damien. She thought about Vincent Caro in a photograph entering a parking structure. She thought about Gerald Price at 2 dinners, deferring in a specific way that had nothing to do with business. She thought about the North Shore property that Elias had purchased 6 months into their marriage and had never once taken her to. She thought about what it meant that Caro was going to be at a meeting between Elias and a man who was connected to the shell companies in Damien's documents, on a property she'd never been allowed to see, on a timeline that had just been moved up without explanation. She said, "They know." Damien was already moving. "Leo, get the car." "They know you're building the case," she said. "Someone told them. Someone in your chain gave them enough to know they need to move faster." Damien stopped. He turned and looked at her. For the first time since she'd been in this house, she saw something in his face that was not controlled. It was brief, a flash, the surface tension breaking for 2 seconds. And it was not fear, but the precursor to something that would become dangerous if given time to develop. He said, "Yes." She held his gaze. Her son was still. The file was in her hands. The afternoon had gone somewhere she hadn't predicted when she'd sat down in the library to take Raymond Fitch's call. And the shape of the next hours was unclear, but the direction of it was not. She said, "Then we don't have 3 days anymore." "No," said Damien Moretti. "We have tonight." And the look on his face, in the 3 seconds before it closed back into control, was the look of a man who had been running a careful, measured operation for 2 years and had just been told the clock had been reset by someone on the inside, someone inside his own walls. And the only move left, Damien moved fast and without noise, the way men who have operated under pressure for a long time move. No wasted motion, no visible adjustment to the new information, just the immediate physical translation of changed circumstances into changed action. He was at the cabinet in 4 strides, pulling equipment Naomi couldn't fully identify. A radio of some kind, a second phone, a handgun that he checked with the flat efficiency of reflex and holstered without looking at her. She watched him and said, "Who knew about the operation timeline in your organization?" He didn't stop moving. "Limited list." "Leo?" Leo in the doorway said, "No," and said it with enough quiet weight that she believed him. "Then who?" Damien picked up the radio and keyed it twice. A response came back, a voice she didn't recognize, terse, confirming something in a shorthand she couldn't decode. He said into it, "North Shore and 40. Full perimeter. I want eyes on the property before we move." He set it down. He looked at her. "You stay here. If Caro is there, you stay here." He said it the same way he said most things, but there was something beneath the evenness this time, a tension in the jaw, a line at the corner of his eye that hadn't been there this morning. "Dr. Reyes is in the East Wing. Leo stays with you. The house goes to full lockdown in 10 minutes. She looked at him. She could see that the controlled surface was costing him more right now than it usually did, and that the cost was not about Elias or Price or even Caro. It was something else, something he was carrying into this car ride with a specific weight she didn't fully understand yet. She said, "Be careful." He looked at her for 1 second longer than necessary. Then he left. The lockdown was quiet and total. She heard the system engage in stages. Doors she hadn't noticed before closing and locking with magnetic precision throughout the house. External shutters dropping over the ground floor windows with a low hum, the lighting shifting subtly to something lower and less visible from outside. Leo moved through it all with the unhurried competence of a man running a drill he'd run dozens of times, checking positions, speaking briefly into an earpiece, his eyes running constant sweeps of the room she was in, as if she might dissolve if he looked away long enough. She sat in the library. She had the Caro file in her lap. She read the same page 3 times without absorbing it. She said, "Leo?" He looked at her from his position near the door. "How long has he been building this case against Elias?" 26 months. And before that, the financial irregularities, the shell companies using his father's money. Leo considered for a moment. He said, "You'd have to ask him when that started. My involvement has been 26 months, but it's been longer." "I think so, yes." She looked down at the file. "He has a leak inside his own people." "Looks that way." "He knows it too. He knew it the moment you told him the meeting moved." She looked up. "He has a face for about 2 seconds before he puts the control back on. Did you see it?" Leo said carefully, "I've worked for Damien Moretti for 9 years. I've seen that face 3 times. What were the other 2? He looked at her steadily. "His father's death, and the day we confirmed the clinic irregularities." He paused. "He doesn't show it to many people." She held that. She looked at the file in her lap and then at the window, shuttered now, the grounds invisible. She thought about a man who had carried the possibility that his mother's actions had produced a half-sibling he couldn't find for however many years he'd known, and had built a machine of investigation and consequence around it, and kept it running through grief and infiltration and a clock that had just been kicked over by someone on the inside. She thought, he is not a good man in the traditional sense of the word. She did not think good man covered or failed to cover what he was. She thought he was a specific and complicated thing that she did not have the vocabulary for yet, and that she was learning the vocabulary faster than she'd anticipated, and that this fact was one she should perhaps be more alarmed about than she currently was. Her son kicked. She put her hand on him. She waited. It was past midnight when Damien came back. She heard the car on the gravel, and then the magnetic locks releasing, and then footsteps on the stairs. Not Leo's pattern, heavier, longer stride, and she was already standing when the library door opened. He came in and stopped. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was blood on his left sleeve. Not much. A transfer stain, the kind you get when you're close to something that's bleeding rather than bleeding yourself. The specific rust-brown shape of contact rather than origin. His jaw was set at the angle she'd come to recognize as his version of holding something back, and there was something in his eyes that was different from anything she'd seen in the 5 days she'd been in his house. She said, "Sit down." He said, "I'm fine." "I didn't ask if you were fine. Sit down." He sat. He chose the chair opposite hers, which was something he always did. The physical distance maintained, the consistent margin. And she was aware for the first time that it was not coldness, the distance. It was the careful behavior of a man who has learned to distrust his own impulses in proximity to things that matter to him. She sat. She said, "Tell me." He put his elbows on his knees. He looked at the floor for a moment. He said, "Price was there. Caro was there. And there was a third person." "Who?" He looked up. He said, "Marco Stein." The name took 2 seconds to land. Then it landed. She said, "Your financial director." "Yes." She let the silence be what it was for a moment. Marco Stein is the leak. Marco Stein has been working with Elias Carter for 8 months. Not as a turncoat. From the beginning, he was placed in my organization. Elias's people identified Marco 2 years ago through the Meridian Group connection and turned him before I ever brought him in. I brought in a man who was already compromised. He said it with the specific flatness of someone describing a wound that is severe enough to require a different register than pain. Every piece of operational planning that crossed Marco's desk for 8 months went to Elias. The Caro documentation, the investor pressure campaign, the timing of every move I made against his financial structure. A pause. "He knew I had you. He's known from day 2. The room absorbed this. She felt the shape of it, the scope of what 8 months of internal access meant, what it meant for the operation, for the case she was trying to build with Raymond Fitch, for every assumption she'd been operating on since she'd sat down at Damien's table and offered him what she knew about Gerald Price. She said, "Where's Marco now?" Damien said nothing. She held his gaze. She said, "And Elias?" "What happened tonight?" "Elias wasn't there." He leaned back. His hands came off his knees. Price and Caro and Marco were running a secondary meeting. Price is liquidating his share of the shell companies, all 3 simultaneously, tonight. The assets are being moved offshore through a framework that my legal team cannot touch, because the jurisdiction transfer was completed 2 hours ago while we were still on the road north. He paused. Elias has been preparing this exit for 60 days, not from me, from the investors who were already turning. He knew the structure was collapsing, and he's been protecting the nucleus while the outer layers burned. How much? Enough. Enough to start over. Enough to vanish into a different legal identity for the assets and surface in 2 years as something else. He looked at her directly. He doesn't need Carter Technologies anymore. He's already past it. What we've been dismantling was the expendable layer. He let us take it. The understanding came in cold and complete. She said, "He fed us the outer operation to protect the inner one. The visible companies, the traceable money, the public collapse of Carter Technologies, that was the performance. We were meant to take it and think we'd won." "Yes." And Marco fed him our timeline so Elias knew exactly when to complete the offshore transfer. He needed us focused on the North Shore meeting while the money moved. "Yes." She stood up. She didn't have a destination. She just needed to be upright, needed the physical adjustment. She crossed to the window that was still shuttered and stopped in front of it and put one hand against the closed metal and breathed. Her son was still. Even he seemed to understand that the next several minutes required a quality of quiet. She said, "What does he do with me now?" Damien said, "He doesn't need you as leverage for the Empire anymore. The Empire is already past the point where you're useful leverage for it." He paused, and she heard the weight of what came next before he said it. "Which means you become a different kind of problem." The paternity challenge is still filed. If the DNA test runs in court and confirms what I believe about the child's biology, he finds out the child isn't his by blood, she said. And he has a filing that establishes paternity doubt. If the result is confirmed, if it says the child doesn't share his DNA, he gets what he wanted from the custody framework, no obligation. And the child becomes a loose end. A pause. Not to Elias necessarily, but to Price. Price knows the Moretti name in that DNA test result means the Moretti organization has a blood claim on a child that makes the child relevant to people who would very much like leverage over that organization. The silence was absolute. She turned from the shuttered window. She looked at him. She said, "They'll come for my son." He held her gaze. "Not while I'm alive." She heard it. She heard the specific weight of it and what it cost him to say it that plainly, and how different it was from everything else he'd said in 5 days, which was plain enough, but never quite this direct, never quite at the level of "not while I'm alive," delivered without drama or qualification. She said, "Damien, look at me." He was already looking at her. He didn't look away. She said, "What happened to Marco?" A long pause. He said, "He's been handled." "Is he alive?" Another pause. He said, "Yes." She believed him. She wasn't sure why she believed him. She had insufficient evidence for certainty. But the word landed with the particular texture of a true thing, and she accepted it. "Okay," she said. "Then here's what we do now." He looked at her, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen there before. Not quite surprise, not quite relief. Something that was closer to the feeling of a man who has been carrying a weight alone for a very long time and has just had someone put a hand to the other end of it. She said, "We don't need the offshore assets. We need Elias in person. Where is he right now? Physical location, tonight?" Damien said, "The downtown penthouse. The one registered to a holding company Serena Voss's foundation controls. He's been there since the gala. He'll stay there tonight? Likely. And Price? Gone by morning. He's already booked under a different name." She thought. She thought about 3 years of watching Elias manage people, about the specific dynamics she'd cataloged without meaning to, who he feared, who he deferred to, what happened to the performance when enough pressure accumulated that it slipped. She thought about Gerald Price at dinner deferring in the way that had nothing to do with business leverage and everything to do with something personal. She thought about Elias knowing something about Price's daughter from the first marriage. She said, "The daughter. Elias knows something about Price's daughter that gives him control over Price. We haven't been able to identify what." "I have a guess." She crossed back to her chair and sat and looked at him. "Her name is Caroline Price. She was about 19 at the second dinner I had with them. Gerald mentioned her once. She was studying overseas. The way he said it, something was wrong. He caught himself and moved on. Elias looked at his wine glass while Price said it, which is what Elias does when he already knows what you're about to say and is waiting for you to get to the end." She paused. "Whatever's wrong with Caroline Price, whatever she did or what was done to her, Elias knows. And Price has been cooperative for however long Elias has held it." Damien was very still. He said, "If we find that information, you can offer Price a different arrangement. His silence about the offshore transfer in exchange for immunity on the shell company connections. Price turns on Elias and your legal team gets the framework they need to freeze the offshore assets through international channels. That's not fast. No, but Elias thinks he has time. He thinks tonight bought him everything he needed, and we're sitting here counting our losses. He won't run for at least a week. He'll wait to see the fallout first. He needs to watch." She held his gaze. "He has an ego that functions like a structural element. Without seeing the damage, he can't leave. He won't be able to help himself." A long silence. Damien said, "You know him." "I was married to him for 3 years." She said it without bitterness, or with bitterness so compressed it had become something else, something functional rather than corrosive. Yes, I know him. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Caroline Price, I'll have someone start in the morning. Start tonight, she said. We don't have the luxury of morning rhythms anymore. He reached for the radio. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the bed in the room with the bolt on the inside of the door, and she stared at the ceiling, and she did the accounting that a person does at 3 a.m. when the structure of their life has been dismantled by stages and the new shape of things is still resolving. She thought about Elias in a downtown penthouse registered to another woman's foundation. She thought about Marco Stein at 8 months of access and the precise clinical horror of that. Every careful move telegraphed ahead, every pressure point already known, the feeling of having been observed at close range by something that was pretending to be on your side. She thought about Damien saying, "Not while I'm alive," and the quality of silence that it held in the room afterward. She put her hand on her son and said, in the dark, "I'm going to get you out of this. Whatever that takes. Whatever I have to become to do it." She paused. The house was quiet around her, the lockdown still engaged, the unseen perimeter still running its patterns. "I'm not the woman in that ballroom anymore. I don't think I could be again, even if I tried." She wasn't sure how she felt about that. She decided she'd figure it out later, on the other side of whatever tonight had started and whatever tomorrow was going to ask of her. At 8 a.m, Leo knocked and said through the door that Damien needed her. She was already dressed. She had been dressed since 6. She opened the door and followed Leo upstairs, and when she came into the war room, Damien was at the table and the woman with the short-cut natural hair was back. Her name, Naomi had learned the previous evening, was Jade, and she processed information faster than anyone else in the room by a visible margin. And between them on the table was a photograph and a printed document and a look on Damien's face that told her they'd found something in the night. He said, "Caroline Price." She came to the table. 18 months ago, she was involved in an incident overseas, a private clinic in Geneva. Different kind of clinic, the kind that handles situations discreetly. The situation involved the child of a man with a significant public profile, and Caroline was present in a support capacity, and the documentation from the clinic was supposed to have been destroyed. He set the photograph down. "It wasn't. Elias has a copy. We found the intermediary who handled the transfer of documents 14 months ago." Naomi looked at the photograph. At a young woman who looked like her father around the jaw. She looked away. "He's been holding it over Price for over a year." "Yes." "Does Price know Elias has been using him as a shield for the offshore structure?" "I don't think he understood the full scope." Damien looked at the document. "He understood he was compliant. I don't think he understood he was being used as a firewall." "Then he's angry," she said. "Or he will be when he understands it." She straightened. "Can you get Price on the phone today, before he leaves the country?" "We have his private number." "Then call him, not to threaten. Call him and tell him exactly what the offshore transfer was, and what his role in it looks like from the outside, and what a prosecutor would make of it. Tell him what we have on the shell companies. Tell him we can bury it or use it." She paused. "And then offer him the Caroline document. Tell him we have a copy, and Elias's copy can be neutralized if he cooperates. We're not trading his daughter's privacy. We're returning it." Jade was looking at her with an expression that was close to the first fully unguarded look Naomi had received from anyone in this house. She said, "That's a strong play." "It's the right play," Naomi said. "Price isn't a criminal. He's a man who got cornered and stayed cornered because he couldn't see a way out that didn't destroy his daughter. Give him the way out." Damien looked at her. He said, "And when Elias finds out Price has turned?" "He panics," she said. "Elias Carter has managed his exits very carefully and very systematically, and he has never once, in the time I've known him, faced a situation where he couldn't see the next move. When Price turns, he loses his offshore protection and his legal firewall simultaneously." She looked at Damien steadily. "And then he does something stupid. And when Elias Carter does something stupid, he aims it at the thing he still thinks he has control over. A pause. She let it sit. She said, "Me." The room went quiet. Damien's jaw set. Not differently than she'd seen it before, not dramatically, but with a kind of finality, a lock clicking over. He said, "He'll come for you. He'll try to use me to get leverage back over you," she said, "because by then he'll know you have me. He's known from day 2, according to what Marco gave him. He's been sitting on it. If price turns and the offshore assets are threatened, he'll decide you're the primary problem and I'm the fastest tool available." She kept her voice level, kept her hands still. Her son shifted inside her, slow and heavy, a reminder of what was underneath every calculation she was making. "So we let him think that's going to work," Jade said very quietly. "You want to use yourself as bait." "I want to use his certainty that I'm still the weakest point in this situation," she said. "He has never once stopped underestimating me. Not at the gala, not in the filing, not in sending men to the alley." She looked at Damien. "Let him keep underestimating me. It's the most useful thing he's ever done." Damien was looking at her with an expression she was only beginning to have the vocabulary for. It was the expression of a man recalibrating something he'd thought he already had the measure of, finding the actual dimensions larger than he'd estimated, and having the specific quality of character to allow the recalibration without defending the prior estimate. He said, "I'm not putting you or your son in harm's way, regardless of the strategic value." "I know," she said. "That's why I trust the plan." She held his gaze. "Because I know you'll have everything in place before he gets within range. That's not bait. That's a trap with me as the fixed point." A long silence. Leo was watching the exchange with the expression of a man who has witnessed his employer surprised by something for only the 3rd or 4th time in 9 years and was quietly committing it to memory. Damien said, "We call price first. We see what he does. Then we build the next position." "Agreed," she said. He reached for the phone. She pulled out a chair and sat at the table, and Jade slid a document toward her without being asked. The Price financial summary, clean and annotated, the shape of the man's exposure laid out in clean columns, and Naomi pulled it close and read it with the focus of a woman who had decided, at some hour of the sleepless night just concluded, that the person she'd been before the Whitmore Grand Gala was not coming back, and that the person she was becoming was harder and sharper and still, underneath it all, built on the same foundation, the flat refusal to accept that the size of another person's cruelty defined the size of her options. She heard Damien begin speaking on the phone. She heard him say Gerald with the specific weight of a man who does not use first names casually, but is doing so now to establish a particular kind of intimacy. The intimacy of two people who are about to have a conversation that will change the shape of things. She read the document. She waited. She kept her hand on her son, and she did not see, because she was looking at the document and Damien was looking at the phone, the way Leo turned to check the exterior feed on the secondary screen in the corner, the feed she hadn't known was running, and went very still for 3 seconds before he crossed the room to Damien's side and leaned down and said something in a voice too low to hear while Damien was still on the phone. She looked up. Leo was pointing at the secondary screen. Damien ended the call. He looked at the screen. He looked at Leo. He said something with no sound, mouth only, 2 words, and she read them off his lips because she was watching his face by this point, and the 2 words were how many? Leo held up 4 fingers. Damien looked at the screen for 1 more second. Then he looked at Naomi, and the expression on his face was the 3rd time Leo had ever seen it, and it was worse than the other 2 because the other 2 had been about things already lost, and this one was about something still present that was about to be threatened. He said, "Naomi, get up, right now." She got up. He said, "They're already on the grounds." She stood and her chair scraped back and her son woke up. 3 sharp kicks, rapid, urgent, as if he knew, as if his body understood before hers did what the word already meant in a sentence spoken by a man who had been running a secure perimeter. And Damien was already moving toward the door, and Leo was reaching for something in his jacket, and the lights in the war room flickered once, fast, and then the building went dark. Not the soft dark of a power fluctuation. The sudden absolute dark of a system cut at the source. She heard Damien's voice from 3 feet away. No phone, no radio, just his voice at the volume of a man who has trained himself not to shout when shouting would cost him something. He said, "Stay close. Do not let go of my arm. Whatever you hear, whatever happens, stay close and do not stop moving." She found his arm in the dark. She closed her hand around it. She felt him move and she moved with him, and behind them the door to the war room opened from the outside with a sound that was not a key and not a code, but was the sound of a mechanism overridden by something that had no interest in the distinction between locked and unlocked. And the first voice she heard from the doorway was not Leo's, and was not anyone she recognized, and said, in the particular flat tone of a professional instruction, "Nobody moves and this stays simple." She had heard those exact words before. In an alley 8 days ago, outside the Whitmore Grand in the dark, with her phone on the pavement and a ballroom full of people who had just watched her husband announce that she was finished. She had heard those words, and she had been terrified and alone and 7 months pregnant on a wet sidewalk with nothing and no one and no floor beneath her. She heard them again now and felt Damien's arm tense under her hand with the specific readiness of a man about to do something decisive. And what she felt was not the same as what she had felt in the alley. What she felt was cold and focused and completely clear, the way a person feels when they have already decided who they are going to be, and the decision has settled into the bones and doesn't need revisiting. She was not the woman in the alley anymore. She tightened her grip on his arm and leaned close and said, into the dark, 2 inches from his ear, in a voice that did not shake, "I know another way out of this building. The East Wing. The access-controlled corridor. There's a secondary exit behind the medical suite. Dr. Reyes showed me the first day." A breath. They won't know about it. Marco was never in that part of the house. A half-second pause. She could feel him processing, assessing, running the building layout against what she'd just told him. He said, against her ear, "You're sure?" She said, "I'm sure." And in the absolute dark of a building that had just been cut at its foundation by men sent by a man who had decided she was still the weakest point in the equation, Naomi Brooks turned them both toward the East Corridor and began to move, leading the way through a house she'd spent 5 days learning by instinct and quiet observation, because she had understood, at some level below the level of strategy, that knowledge of the exits was the most important thing a woman in her position could accumulate, and she had accumulated it. And now it was the only thing standing between her son and whatever was coming through the door behind them. The East Corridor was narrow and dark, and she knew it by feel. 5 days of walking this house, running her hand along walls in the early mornings when she couldn't sleep, counting doors, memorizing the way the floor changed texture from hardwood to tile at the junction between the main wing and the medical suite. She moved fast. Damien was a step behind her, his hand on her shoulder not gripping, just present, a point of contact that told her without words that he was there and moving, and she did not need to look back. Behind them she heard Leo's voice, low, controlled, buying seconds, and then something that was not a voice, and she did not look back. She did not look back. The door to the medical suite was unlocked. Dr. Reyes had shown her the secondary exit on day 1, with the practical calm of a woman who had worked in environments where knowing the exits was not paranoia but professional obligation. It was behind the equipment cabinet, a door that looked like a wall panel until you pressed the upper right corner and the latch released. She found it in the dark by counting from the door frame, 4 feet, palm flat, upper right, and it opened. Cold air. A stairwell. Concrete, unlit, descending. She said, "Down." Damien came through behind her and pulled the panel closed. The latch caught. She was already moving down the stairs, one hand on the rail, the other on her abdomen. Her son had gone still with the particular stillness of a child responding to its mother's adrenaline. Everything consolidated, waiting. 14 steps. A door at the bottom, unlocked, opening outward onto the east side of the grounds, where the tree line started 30 feet from the building's foundation wall. The night was cold and clear, and the security lighting on this side had gone dark with everything else when the system was cut. Good, bad, both simultaneously. She pushed through the door and the cold hit her face, and she stopped and assessed. Tree line, 30 feet of open ground between her and it. Darkness above the property's eastern edge where the hill crested and dropped toward the service road she'd seen once from an upstairs window. Damien was beside her. He had the handgun out. He was scanning the perimeter without moving his feet, a complete sweep, methodical. He said quietly, "You see anyone?" "No." "They'll have someone on this side, standard containment." "Then we move fast, and we move now, while they're still working the interior." He looked at her. In the dark, she could see his face only in outline, the set of the jaw, the angle of the eyes, but she had learned his face well enough in 5 days that outline was sufficient. He said, "You should not be running." "I know," she said. "I'm going to do it anyway." She went. 30 feet of open ground, and she covered it faster than she would have believed she could cover it at 7.5 months, legs driving, arms pumping, the weight of her son distributed forward in a way that threw her center of balance wrong. But she compensated. She'd been compensating for months, and the tree line came up and she went into it, and the branches closed around her, and she stopped against the first large trunk and pressed her back to it and breathed. Damien was 4 seconds behind her. He came in low and fast and stopped beside her, and his breathing was controlled in a way hers was not, which was the difference between a man who had run toward danger in the dark many times and a woman doing it for the first time with a child inside her. She got her breath. She said, "Service road, north, over the crest." "How far?" From the window, it looked like a 1/4 mile, maybe less. He was already scanning through the trees, reading darkness and shadow for what didn't belong. He said, "There's one on the south edge of the tree line, 50 yards, hasn't moved since we came through." "He's watching the open ground." "Yes." "Then we go north through the trees and he never has angle on us." A pause. 1 second, 2. She could feel him weighing it. The terrain, the timeline, her condition, the distance, all of it run through the same machine that ran everything, the one that never stopped processing even when the face above it showed nothing. He said, "Stay tight behind me. If I stop, you stop. If I go down, you're not going down." "If I go down," he said again, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, something that was not rehearsed and was not performance. "You keep going north, service road, flag anything moving. My people will have a vehicle at the north junction in 12 minutes. She looked at him. She said, "How do you know your people weren't compromised?" "Because the North Junction Protocol is something only Leo and I have ever communicated verbally, face to face, never through any channel Marco had access to." A pause. "And because Leo set it in motion before they cut the power. I heard the radio click, 3 shorts. That was the signal." She breathed. She said, "Okay." He moved. She stayed tight behind him. They went north through the dark trees for what felt like much longer than a 1/4 mile, but was probably exactly that. Damien moving with a knowledge of the terrain she didn't have, and setting a pace that was fast without being reckless. And she matched it, step for step, through route and grade change and the particular ankle-threatening irregularity of ground that had never been cleared or maintained. She focused on his back. She focused on her breathing. She focused on the weight of her son, steady and real, the center of everything. They were 2/3 of the way up the grade when she heard movement to their left. Not far, 20 yards. The specific quality of someone moving through underbrush with intentionality rather than accident. She grabbed the back of Damien's jacket, and he stopped instantly. She pointed left. He saw it before she could complete the gesture. Already turning, already making the adjustment, already positioning himself between her and the sound. The figure came through the trees fast and low, and Damien moved to intercept, and it was quick and brutal and almost silent. 3 seconds of controlled violence that she watched from behind a tree with her palm flat on her abdomen and her jaw clenched, and the understanding running cold through her that the man she'd been living beside for 5 days was something specific and dangerous, in ways she had understood abstractly and was now understanding concretely, viscerally, in the dark on a hillside with her son between her ribs. The figure went down and stayed down. Damien came back to her. His breathing had elevated 3 degrees, barely. He said, "Go." They went. The service road was gravel, single lane, running along the north edge of the property. She came out of the tree line onto it and stopped and looked both ways, darkness in both directions. The distant shape of the estate's perimeter fence to the west, the road disappearing into more tree cover to the east. Headlights appeared at the eastern curve, moving slow. No high beams. Damien said, "That's them." The vehicle pulled up, a dark SUV, a man she didn't know behind the wheel, a woman she recognized from the war room in the passenger seat. The rear door opened before it fully stopped, and Damien put his hand on her back and she got in. The door closed. The vehicle moved. She sat in the back seat and her body registered all at once what it had been doing for the last 15 minutes, the run, the terrain, the cold. And she felt the cramps start low and tighten, and she pressed both hands to her abdomen and breathed through it and told herself it was the same as before. Stress response, the same as outside the Whitmore Grand, nothing structural. Damien looked at her from the seat beside her. He said, "Talk to me." "I'm okay." "Naomi." "I'm okay. Keep driving." She met his eyes. "What's the plan now? Where are we going?" He held her gaze for 1 second longer, assessing, checking, the same scan he ran on everything. And then he looked at the driver. "The Callaway Safe House, south of the bridge." The driver said, 22 minutes. 18, Damien said. The vehicle accelerated. None. The Callaway Safe House was a brownstone on a narrow street she didn't recognize, indistinguishable from its neighbors in the particular way of places that have been deliberately made to look like nothing. They went in through a side entrance, and she was taken immediately to a room on the second floor where a man she hadn't seen before handed Damien a phone and a jacket and said 6 words she couldn't hear. Damien's expression didn't change. He thanked the man with a word and came into the room where she was sitting on the edge of a bed with her shoes off and her hands still on her abdomen. He said, "Leo is out. He's at the secondary location." She exhaled. "Good. 3 of my people on the estate were injured, none critically." He sat in the chair opposite the bed. He ran a hand over his face. The first gesture she'd seen from him that was purely tired, that didn't have any operational purpose. "The estate is compromised. I'm not going back." She looked at him. "I know." Elias sent 6 men, which means he's committed now. He's past the point of deniability on this. You can't send 6 men to a private estate and maintain the posture of a man engaged in civil divorce proceedings. He dropped his hand. He's scared. "The Price call..." He stopped. "Did you get through to Price before the power went?" 30 seconds of the call. Enough. A pause. "Enough that Price knows I have the Caroline document. He didn't hang up. He asked for time, which means he's considering." "He'll cooperate," she said. "Give him until morning." "We don't have until morning on every front." He looked at her directly. "Elias's attorney filed an emergency motion at 10 o'clock tonight. Expedited DNA testing. Compelled." The judge is sympathetic to the Carter family. Raymond Fitch pushed back, but the hearing is scheduled for 8 a.m. She absorbed this. She said, "On what grounds can they compel? They're arguing that the child may have been conceived in circumstances that invalidate the marital presumption of paternity. They're citing your residence at my estate as evidence of an ongoing relationship that predates the separation." He said it flatly, without editorial, which was how she knew it cost him something to say it. "They're calling you my mistress in the motion." She looked at the ceiling. She let out a slow breath. She said, "That's actually useful." He blinked. "What?" "If they've filed that motion, they've put my location on record in a court document. As of 10 o'clock tonight, it is a matter of official legal record that I am associated with you and that Elias Carter is aware of this, which means the 6 men he sent to the estate tonight..." She stopped, looked at him. "Do you understand what that means? He filed the court motion and sent the men on the same night, simultaneously. He documented where I was in a legal filing and then sent people to take me from there. That's not just intimidation, that's evidence." The room was quiet. She said, "Raymond Fitch needs that motion in front of a different judge by 7 a.m., not the Carter sympathetic one, a different one. And he needs the timeline. Motion filed at 10, men on the grounds by 11:30. Simultaneous, coordinated. That's not civil divorce litigation, that's criminal." Damien was looking at her with an expression she had, by now, developed enough vocabulary to read. It was the expression he wore when something had moved in a direction he hadn't anticipated, and he was running the implications forward and finding them, on balance, better than the previous position. He said, "I'll get Fitch on the phone." "It's 2 in the morning, I know." "He won't be happy." "No." Something that was almost the smile. "He'll survive it." Raymond Fitch was not happy. She could hear it through the phone from 3 feet away. The timbre of a man awakened at 2 a.m. who is professionally obligated to suppress the full expression of his displeasure. But he listened. She heard his breathing change as the timeline became clear to him, the sharp intake at the point where Damien said simultaneous, same night, documented in the filing, and then the quality of silence that followed, which was the silence of a man who has spent 40 years in courtrooms recognizing a piece of evidence that changes the shape of a case. He said, "I need the court motion document and your account of the timeline at the estate. Everything. When the power went, when the men entered, what was said." Damien said, "You'll have it in 20 minutes. I need a witness to the estate incursion. You'll have 2, and I need Ms. Brooks." A pause, a recalibration toward her. "I need you, Naomi, to be at the courthouse at 7:30. This motion needs a face. It needs you in front of a judge, as a woman 8 months pregnant whose husband filed a legal document placing her location on record and then sent hired operatives to that location on the same evening." Another pause. "I won't lie to you, it's a strong position, but you need to be there." She said, "I'll be there." "Damien Moretti cannot walk into that courthouse with you." A silence. She looked at Damien. He was looking at the phone, jaw set, and she understood what it cost him to sit in a room while she went somewhere he couldn't follow. She said, "I know." Raymond said, "I'll see you at 7:30, and ended the call. She looked at the wall. Her son moved, long, slow, the oceanic movement of a child readjusting, and she breathed with it. She said, without looking at Damien, "He's right. I know he's right. You being there turns it into a different story." "I know." She looked at him. He was looking at the floor with the expression she'd seen only a handful of times, the one that meant something was happening beneath the controlled surface that was too large to fully contain. She said, "You'll have people outside." "Yes. And Elias won't make a move at a courthouse. That's too visible. He's past visible already. The men at the estate, that was panic. He won't compound it in public. He's unpredictable right now." "No," she said. "He's not. He's afraid, which looks like unpredictable but isn't. Afraid people follow their own logic harder, not less. Elias's logic is control. He'll try to reassert control through the proceeding, not around it. He thinks he can still win in court." She looked at him steadily. "Let him think that until Raymond Fitch shows the judge what happened tonight." Damien was quiet. He said, "And after the hearing?" She thought about that, about the shape of the next hours and the shape of what came after. She said, "After the hearing, one way or another, Elias is exposed, not just to us, publicly, officially, and then Price cooperates because Price is a man calculating survival, and with Elias exposed, cooperation is the better survival calculation." She paused. "And then you have what you need for the offshore assets." He said, "And you?" She met his eyes. She said, "And then I have my son. That's what I have." He held her gaze. Something moved in his face that she didn't try to categorize. She let it be what it was, unnamed, present, more honest than most things she'd seen from him. He said, "I'll drive you to the courthouse." "Not to the door." "Not to the door." She nodded. She lay back on the bed with her shoes still off and her hand on her son and looked at the ceiling of a safe house she didn't know. In a city she knew very well and thought, tomorrow. The word felt like a floor, the first solid floor she'd had under her in 9 days. She slept for 3 hours. It was the best 3 hours of sleep she'd had since before the gala set. The courthouse at 7:30 in the morning had the specific energy of a place gearing up for the ordinary machinery of the day. Clerks moving through halls with file carts, the low hum of fluorescent lighting, the smell of the coffee cart near the east entrance. She walked through it in a gray dress that was the most presentable thing she'd been able to source at 6 a.m. from the limited options the safe house provided. Her braids pulled back, her back straight, her hand at her side, rather than on her abdomen because she had decided she was not going to use her pregnancy as a posture. She was going to use it as a fact. Raymond Fitch met her outside courtroom 7. He was a man in his late 60s who wore his decades of courtroom work in his posture rather than his face. Completely upright, the permanent stance of a man who understood that presence was a form of argument. He looked at her, quick and assessing, and said, "You look good." "Thank you, Raymond. How do you feel?" "Clear." He nodded. "The motion has been redirected to Judge Patricia Hollis. She has a very different read on the Carter family reputation than the Judge Elias's team selected." A pause. "She also has a very specific opinion about expedited motions filed simultaneous with property incursions. I may have indicated as much to her clerk at 6 this morning." "Is Elias here?" "His attorney, not Elias himself." A beat. "Which is interesting." She thought about Elias not being here, about what that meant, about the logic of a frightened man who still believed he could win through intermediaries while keeping his own distance. She said, "His attorney's name?" "Douglas Crane." "Good. Expensive. Has a tell when he's operating on incomplete information. He starts citing precedent early." She looked down the corridor. Elias's attorney was visible at the far end, a tall man in a dark suit consulting his phone with the focused expression of someone receiving instructions rather than information. She watched him for 3 seconds. She said, "He's getting instructions right now, real time." Raymond looked down the corridor. He said, "From Elias." "Yes." She watched Crane's thumb move across his screen, pause, move again. "Elias is somewhere close. He needs to be able to respond too fast for email delay." She looked at Raymond. "He's in the building." Raymond looked at her. He said, "The public observation gallery on the 2nd floor. Family law proceedings are public record." She said, "He wants to watch." Raymond said, "He wants to see you lose." She straightened. She felt the thing that had been building in her over 9 days. Not anger exactly, something cooler and more load-bearing than anger. Settle into place like a keystone. She said, "Then let's make sure he sees something else." Raymond held the courtroom door and she walked through it, and she did not look up at the public gallery because she did not need to. The proceeding lasted 40 minutes. Raymond Fitch was, she discovered, a different animal in a courtroom than he was on a phone at 2 a.m. Sharper, faster, with the controlled aggression of a man who knew exactly how much force each moment required and applied exactly that, no more. He presented the timeline. Motion filed at 10:04 p.m., estate incursion initiated at 11:38 p.m., documented in security footage recovered from the estate's backup system which, unlike the primary system, had been running on an independent power source that the intruders had not known about. Crane cited precedent. He cited it on the 3rd exchange, which Raymond had predicted, and which meant he was already behind. Judge Patricia Hollis had a face like a woman who had heard a great many stories and retained a functional skepticism about all of them, but was willing to be persuaded by evidence, and the evidence was good. The evidence was very good. She looked at it for a long time before she said anything, and what she said when she said it was addressed to Crane in a voice that had the particular quality of a judge who is not asking a question but is giving counsel an opportunity to provide a satisfactory answer before she provides one of her own. She said, "Mr. Crane, your client filed a motion at 10 o'clock last evening that placed Ms. Brooks's location on record and identified her association with a private estate. 94 minutes later, according to this documentation, 6 individuals entered that estate without authorization, and 1 pregnant woman was compelled to flee on foot through uncleared terrain in sub-40-degree temperatures at 2 a.m. A pause. "Help me understand why I should view the expedited DNA motion as a separate matter from these events rather than as a component of a coordinated pattern." Crane said, "Your Honor, my client—" "I'm asking you to help me understand," she said. "Not to defend your client. Help me understand." Crane looked at his phone, looked up, said, "We would need additional time to—" "You filed an expedited motion," Judge Hollis said. "Expedited cuts both ways, Mr. Crane." The hearing closed 40 minutes after it opened with the emergency DNA motion denied, a protection order issued, and a referral to the district attorney's office regarding the estate incursion. Raymond Fitch shook her hand outside the courtroom with the genuine warmth of a man who has just watched a proceeding go the right way and knows why. He said, "The referral to the DA is the piece that matters. Once that's in motion—" She said, "I know. Thank you, Raymond. She turned and walked down the corridor toward the east exit, and she did not look at the public gallery above her because she was choosing not to give Elias Carter the satisfaction of her eyes on him, and the choice felt like its own kind of power. The choice to be uninterested, to treat him as a fact of the day that required management rather than a force that required her full attention. She was 20 feet from the east exit when she felt it. Not the Braxton Hicks cramp she had learned to breathe through. Something different, something lower and more fundamental. A tightening that moved from her back through to her front in a single wave and stopped her walking and made her put both hands against the wall beside her. She breathed. She timed it. It passed in 40 seconds. She straightened. She looked at her watch. She had taken 12 steps toward the exit when it happened again. This one was harder. She stopped again and pressed her palm flat against the wall and breathed through her nose and did not make a sound because she was in a courthouse corridor and there were clerks and attorneys, and she was not going to do this here. The wave passed. She checked her watch again. 38 seconds since the last one. Not stress, not Braxton Hicks. Something real and specific and happening now. In a courthouse corridor, 8.5 months in, because her body had apparently decided that the last 9 days were sufficient gestation acceleration and had made its own schedule without consulting her. She pulled out her phone. She called Damien. He picked up on the first ring. She said, "I need you to call Dr. Reyes." A breath. "And I need you to come to the east exit of the courthouse right now." A half-second pause. She heard him understand it. She heard the silence sharpen. He said, "How far apart?" She said, 38 seconds, 37 now. She heard the vehicle door. She heard him moving. He said, "I'm 40 seconds out. Stay on the line." She pressed her back to the wall of the corridor and kept her phone to her ear and breathed and timed and waited. Above her, in the public gallery she had chosen not to look at, she knew Elias Carter was watching her, and she knew he had just watched his emergency motion denied and a protection order issued and a DA referral filed. And she knew from everything she understood about him that the shape of what was happening in him right now was not grief and was not remorse and was not even primarily anger, but was the specific particular anguish of a man who has always believed he was the most important person in any room he occupied, watching the room restructure itself around someone else. She timed another contraction. 35 seconds. She thought, not here. Not in this corridor, not yet. She heard the east door open and felt the cold air. And Damien was there, crossing the distance between them at a speed that was not a run, but was everything just below a run. And he reached her and she looked at him, and what she saw in his face was something she had never seen in 5 days of watching him. Not control, not calculation, not the compressed emotion beneath the managed surface. Something open and direct and completely undefended. He said, "I've got you." She said, "The car." He put his arm around her and they moved toward the door, and she had taken 4 steps when the sound came from behind them. Not a shout, something quieter and therefore more audible in the corridor's acoustics. And she knew the voice before she turned because she had been hearing it for 3 years, and the body remembers what the mind tries to rearrange. Elias Carter said, "Naomi." She turned. He was at the end of the corridor, alone, which meant he'd come down from the gallery, which meant he'd left his attorney, which meant something in him had overridden the careful strategy of distance and intermediaries. And she knew what had overridden it. The protection order, her name on it, his name on it, the permanent official record of this morning's proceeding. It had broken through whatever calculation he'd been running, and what was left was something raw and exposed and ugly and very much the actual Elias Carter that she had occasionally glimpsed in 3 years and had always found a way to explain away. He looked at her. He looked at Damien's arm around her. He looked at her abdomen. Something moved across his face that was complex and terrible, and she didn't have to categorize it to know she was looking at a man who had made a series of choices that had brought him to this corridor, to this moment, and was only now beginning to understand what those choices had cost him. He said, "That's my—" "No," she said. Her voice was level. It cost her nothing to make it level. That surprised her, even now, how little it cost. She said, "Not anymore, Elias. Not in any way that's going to hold." He looked at Damien. Something that was not dignity but was its last surviving relative moved across his face. He said, You think this is... The DA's office will be in contact, she said. Raymond Fitch will handle everything else. She turned back toward the door. She heard him take a step. She heard Damien's arm tighten, not aggressive, just present, the pressure of someone who has assessed a situation and is prepared. And she heard Elias stop. She heard him stop because whatever else he was not a stupid man. And the man whose arm was around her had a quality that communicated very clearly to other men, at a biological and functional level, that stopping was the correct decision. The contraction hit at the east door and she held the frame and breathed through it. And it was the strongest one yet, 42 seconds, and when it released she looked up at Damien, and he was already looking at her and his face was open in the way it had been for the last 8 minutes, and she said, "We need to go right now." He said, "Right now." And they went through the door into the cold morning air where the vehicle was already running and Dr. Reyes was already on the phone, and the city moved around them, indifferent and enormous, and inside her, her son pushed against her palm one more time, urgent, insistent, the most alive thing she had ever carried, as if to say, "I am here, I am ready, I have been waiting, and I am not going to wait any longer." He was born at 11:17 in the morning in a room that smelled of antiseptic and clean linen, in a private medical facility 40 minutes south of the courthouse, with Dr. Reyes at one end of the bed and Damien Moretti standing at the other side of it because Naomi had reached for his hand during the 3rd hour of labor, and he had given it to her without hesitation, and neither of them had addressed this afterward as anything other than what it was: a person needing an anchor and another person being one. Labor was 11 hours, not the worst Dr. Reyes had attended, and not the easiest. And at hour 8, when things became difficult in a way that required everyone in the room to work at the edge of their competence, Naomi did not scream and did not beg and did not ask for anything except water, and once, very quietly, for Damien to stop looking at the monitors and look at her instead because the monitors were not the point. He looked at her. He did not look away again. At 11:17 a.m., her son came into the world at 6 pounds 14 ounces, with a cry that was short and declarative and then done, as if he had announced his arrival and saw no need to repeat himself. Dr. Reyes put him on Naomi's chest. He was warm and damp, and his eyes were the dark, unfocused eyes of a creature brand new to light, and he turned his head toward her voice when she said his name. "Marcus," she said, and felt Damien go very still beside her. And the movement was small and animal and the most extraordinary thing she had ever witnessed. She looked up. Damien was looking at the child with the expression she had no vocabulary for and had stopped trying to categorize, and whatever it was, it lived below language and below strategy and below all the architecture of control that he had built around himself over however many years, and it was the truest thing she'd seen on a human face in a very long time. She said, "Marcus." He said nothing. He reached out one hand and touched the child's head, the knuckle of his index finger, the most careful touch, like a man handling something he was afraid to damage. And then he withdrew his hand and cleared his throat and looked at the window instead, and she let him have that. Gerald Price called Raymond Fitch at 2 in the afternoon on the day Marcus was born. Raymond called her at 4, when she was awake and the room was quiet, and Damien had gone to make calls from the corridor. Raymond said, "Price is cooperating. Full disclosure on the shell companies, the offshore transfer mechanism, the role of the Meridian Group in the asset laundering." A pause. "He wants immunity on his own exposure in exchange for documented testimony against Elias Carter." She said, "What does the DA's office say?" "They're inclined to accept it. Price's testimony, combined with what came out of the courthouse proceeding this morning, gives them a strong enough case to move." Another pause. "The Caroline document, I've assured him it will be returned to him and that no copy will be retained. I'll need your confirmation on that." She said, "Confirmed. Return it." Raymond was quiet for a moment. He said, "Naomi, how are you?" She looked at the child asleep in the hospital bassinet beside her bed. His fist was curled against his cheek. He was breathing in the slow, total way of newborns, the way that looks like the whole body is committed to it, nothing held in reserve. She said, "Tell me about the DNA test." Raymond said, "The expedited motion was denied, but Elias's attorney refiled through a different channel this morning, before the protection order was fully processed. It's going to be heard, probably within the week." He paused. "I think you should get ahead of it." She said, "Meaning if the result is going to say what Damien Moretti believes it will say, it is better for it to surface through your counsel than through Elias's motion. It changes the frame. It changes everything about how that information enters the record." She looked at the bassinet. She said, "I know." She ended the call. She lay back and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Damien came back 20 minutes later. He sat in the chair beside her bed, closer than he usually sat, the institutional context of the room having apparently overridden his customary margin, and looked at Marcus in the bassinet. She said, "We need to talk about the test." He looked at her. She said, "Raymond thinks we should initiate it through my counsel, before Elias's motion is heard. He's right. If the result is what you believe, it will be." She looked at him. "You can't know that. I've had 3 years to work through the clinic records and the dates and the access logs for the sample storage. I can't be certain without the test, but I'm close enough to certain that I've been operating as if." He held her gaze. "That's not the same as knowing. I understand the difference." She said, "And if it isn't? If it comes back and the result says something else?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Then I have a child in my facility named Marcus who was born while his mother held my hand, and the result changes the legal framework, but it doesn't change what happened in this room this morning." A pause. "It doesn't change what I intend." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "What do you intend, Damien?" He looked at the child. He said, "To not be what I've been, if that's possible." He said it slowly, carefully, like a man reading a map he'd been afraid to look at directly. "I'm not certain it's possible. I know what I've built and what I've done to build it, and I know it doesn't disappear because I'd prefer it to. But He stopped. He looked at his hands, the split knuckles still healing. "My father died not knowing he had a grandchild. My mother spent 14 years carrying what she'd done and never told anyone, and died on an overpass in the rain." He looked up. "I don't want to be a man who leaves things that important unsaid until there's no time left." The room was quiet except for the small breathing of the child between them. She said, "Initiate the test through Raymond. We'll have it by the end of the week." He nodded. She said, "And then we talk about what comes after. All of it. No operations, no intermediaries." She held his gaze. "You and me, at a table, talking about what this looks like." He said, "Yes." She said, "Get some sleep. You look terrible." Something moved across his face, the almost smile, which she had by now catalogued in its full range of variations, and which this version of was the closest it had ever gotten to actually arriving. He said, "You just gave birth 11 hours ago." "I'm aware," she said. "Go sleep." He didn't go far. She found out later he'd spent the night in a chair in the corridor outside her room, which she did not address with him directly, but which she filed in the same place she filed all the things about him that didn't fit any category she'd previously had. The DNA results came back in 6 days. Raymond Fitch delivered them in person, which told her everything before he opened the envelope. He sat across from her in the room she'd been moved to. A suite now, quieter, Marcus in a proper crib. And he opened the envelope and read the relevant section aloud without preamble. The child's biological father was not Elias Carter. The result was consistent with the biological profile of the Moretti family line, cross-referenced against the clinic records from Meridian Fertility Associates, which Raymond had obtained through the estate's legal documentation that Damien had provided. Raymond set the paper down. He said, "This is significant." "Yes." In Elias's motion context, it removes his paternity claim entirely. He has no standing in any custody or support proceeding regarding this child. "Yes." In the broader context of the clinic conspiracy, this, combined with the documentation on Elena Moretti's irregularities and the timeline of procedures at Meridian, this is enough to support a civil case against the clinic's former board of directors, 2 of whom are still living, for unauthorized use of genetic material. He paused. That's a longer road, but it's there. She said, "What about Damien?" Raymond looked at her carefully. Biological paternity without a formal agreement or existing marriage is handled through a voluntary acknowledgement of paternity or a court order. If both parties consent, it's relatively straightforward. He paused. The complication is his profile. Any court involvement with the Moretti name will draw scrutiny that he's aware, she said. He's already got his own attorneys working the angle. Raymond nodded slowly. He said, "And what is it that you want, Naomi? Not strategically, not legally. What do you want?" She looked at Marcus in the crib. He was awake, doing the thing he'd started doing in the last 2 days, where he tracked moving things with his eyes. Not fully, not accurately, but the attempt was there, the reaching toward, and it did something to her chest every time she watched it that she could not have articulated to another person, but did not need to. She said, "I want my son to grow up knowing who he is, all of it, where he came from, what it cost to get here, who the people around him actually are instead of the performance version of them." She looked at Raymond. "I want him to know a version of the truth that he can carry without it destroying him." Raymond said, "That's a complicated truth." "Most real ones are," she said. Well, the charges against Elias Carter were filed 22 days after Marcus was born. The DA's office moved with the efficiency of a body that had received multiple streams of converging evidence and understood that delay served only the defense. The charges were extensive: wire fraud, money laundering through the shell company structure, conspiracy in the coordinated harassment and intimidation of a protected individual. The protective order from Judge Hollis gave that last one particular legal teeth, and 4 counts related to the unauthorized commissioning of the estate incursion. Vincent Caro, who had been cooperating since his second conversation with a federal investigator who appeared to know considerably more about his operation than should have been possible through legitimate channels, provided a documented account of the instruction chain that placed Elias Carter unambiguously at the origin of both the alley incident outside the Whitmore Grand and the North Shore operation. Elias's attorney, Douglas Crane, filed 3 motions in the first week and had 2 of them denied in the first 10 days, which was, Raymond told her, a pace of legal attrition that suggested the DA's office had built the case with care and was not going to be outmaneuvered by motions' volume. She was not in the courtroom when Elias was arraigned. She was in the park 4 blocks from the brownstone Brianna had helped her find. A proper apartment now, her own lease, her own key, sitting on a bench in the early March cold with Marcus bundled against her chest in a carrier and her sister beside her eating a sandwich they'd bought from the cart near the fountain. Brianna said, "Do you want to know how it went?" She said, "Tell me." He entered a not guilty plea, which everyone expected. His bail application was denied on flight risk grounds. A pause. He looked, I don't know, smaller than he was. She looked at the fountain. "He was always that size," she said. "I just wasn't looking at him right." Brianna was quiet for a moment. She said, "I want to meet him, Damien." "I know. You've been doing this thing where you talk about what's happening around him and adjacent to him, and you never actually say, 'I know.'" Brianna looked at her sideways. "Is he good to you?" She thought about that, about what the word good encompassed, what it failed to encompass, what it meant in the context of a man who had been something specific and difficult for a long time and was engaged in the complicated and non-linear process of becoming something else without denying what he'd been. She thought about a hand in a corridor, and not while I'm alive, and a chair outside a hospital room, and the way he'd touched her son's head with the knuckle of one finger, like he was afraid to break something that mattered. She said, "He's honest, consistently, in a way that's rare." A pause. "The rest of it is something we're still figuring out." Brianna ate her sandwich. She said, "Okay." And then after a moment, "He better be." Marcus made a sound against her chest. Not crying, something between a sound and a breath, the newborn vocabulary of a person still inventing language. And she pressed her palm to the back of his head through the carrier fabric, and felt his warmth, and felt the small percussion of his heartbeat, and thought, "Here, right here. This is the floor." The legal resolution of the Moretti paternity acknowledgement took 4 months. It was not simple, and it was not clean, and there were 3 separate proceedings and 2 jurisdictions involved before it was finished. And in that time, she and Damien had exactly 11 conversations at tables. Real ones, the kind he had promised, without operations or intermediaries, that were the hardest and most important conversations she'd had with another person in her life. He told her things in those conversations that she understood he had never told anyone else, not from the sentiment of disclosure, but from the fact of its difficulty, the way it cost him, visibly, the way he had to stop and regroup and start again, which was foreign to a man who had built his entire operational identity on not needing to regroup. She told him things too, about the 3 years inside the marriage and what she'd excused and what she'd taught herself not to notice, and the specific slow erosion of a woman who has been told implicitly and consistently that her attention is not welcome in the room where decisions are being made. She told him about the night of the gala, not the facts, which he already knew, but the interior of it. The feeling of standing with a water glass and the math she'd been running in her legs, and the moment the math had stopped because there was no longer a calculation to run. He listened to all of it without offering anything corrective or palliative, which was what she needed and what most people were incapable of providing. The operation against the offshore assets concluded in month 3 through a combination of Price's testimony and a jurisdictional agreement that Damien's legal team had spent 6 weeks negotiating. The assets were not fully recovered. Some of them had moved through enough layers that recovery was technically impossible without a legal framework that didn't exist. But enough was frozen, and enough was traceable, and enough of the structure was exposed that the financial identity Elias had been building for his post-Carter Technologies life was dismantled before he could access it. His trial date was set for 8 months after the arraignment. Raymond Fitch told her she would be called as a witness, and she said she would be ready, and she meant it. Leo came to the apartment once, in month 2. He appeared at the door with a briefcase and a bottle of wine that he set on the counter without ceremony, and said Damien had sent him to review the security arrangements. She reviewed them with him, which took 20 minutes, and then she poured them both a glass of the wine and said, 9 years. He said, yes. She said, have you ever seen him like this before? Leo considered for a long moment. He said, I've seen him decide things before. Important things. Things that cost him. He turned his wine glass. I've never seen him unsure about a decision and proceed anyway. She said, is that what you see? He looked at her. He said, I see a man who doesn't know how this turns out and is doing it anyway. For him, that's new. A pause. That's not small. She thought about that after he left. She thought about it the way she thought about most things now. Not urgently, not with the compressed adrenaline of the 11 days between the gala and Marcus's birth, but with the slower and more lasting attention of a person who has come through something and is learning what she brought out of it. In the spring, 4 months after Marcus was born, Damien came to her apartment with a folder. She knew what it was before he opened it. She'd been waiting for it in the way you wait for something when you already know the shape of it but need the concrete reality before you can move. He sat at her kitchen table, her kitchen, her lease, and he opened the folder and he said, the Moretti organization is being restructured. I've been in negotiations with federal regulators for 6 weeks through an intermediary. What I'm offering is full disclosure of the financial network in exchange for a supervised transition into legitimate operations over a 24-month period. It's not immunity. There are penalties and there is oversight and there are things I will have to answer for. He looked at her. But at the end of 24 months, the organization is clean or gone, one or the other. She looked at him. She said, what made you decide? He was quiet for a moment. He said, Marcus. And then after a pause that held the weight of a much longer sentence, and the understanding that I do not want my son to learn my name the way I learned my father's, piece by piece, from other people, after it was too late to ask questions. She held his gaze. She said, there will be things in the disclosure that affect people you've worked with. Yes. People who trusted you. Yes. He held her gaze without looking away. I know what it costs. I'm paying it anyway. She looked at the folder. She looked at Marcus in his chair on the kitchen floor, batting at a mobile she'd hung from the chair arm, utterly absorbed in the simple mechanical miracle of a thing that moved when he touched it. She looked back at Damien. She said, "Then do it." He nodded. He closed the folder. He stayed for dinner. This was not new. He had been staying for dinner with increasing regularity over the last 6 weeks in a pattern that neither of them had named or scheduled, and that had simply accreted, the way habits form when the conditions are right and neither party objects. She made pasta because it was what she had, and he sat at the table and held Marcus while she cooked, and she watched them from the stove, the big man and the 4-month-old, one looking at the other with the wondering focus of a child discovering a face, the other looking back with the expression she would never have the complete vocabulary for and had stopped needing it. After dinner, she washed dishes and he dried them, and the ordinariness of it was so complete and so specific that she stopped for a moment in the middle of it and looked at her own hands under the water and thought, this is what the other side of a thing looks like. Not triumph, not resolution the way stories resolve, clean and declarative. Just this, a kitchen, dishes, a child in a chair, the sound of the city outside, the presence of a person beside you that you know and don't fully know, and are, despite all reasonable caution, still choosing to let closer. She said, without looking up from the dishes, "Brianna wants to meet you." He said, "I know. Leo told me." She looked up. "Leo told you?" "Leo has opinions about everything. He doesn't always share them with me directly." A pause. "He likes you," is the operational summary. She laughed. It surprised her. The laugh, the way it came out uncomplicated and real, and without the awareness of itself that laughter had carried for a while in the worst of it. She laughed, and she put a wet hand to her face, and when she lowered it, he was looking at her with an expression that was the full arrival of the thing that had been almost arriving for 4 months. And this time it reached his eyes and stayed there, and she looked at it and did not look away. She said, "Saturday, Brianna's place. She'll make too much food and ask you questions you won't want to answer." He said, "I'll answer them." She said, "You don't have to answer all of them." "I know," he said. "I'll answer them anyway." She handed him the last dish. He dried it. She drained the sink and dried her hands and leaned against the counter and looked at the kitchen, her cups on the hooks she'd put in herself, Marcus's things on the side table, the window that looked west and caught the late light in the evenings, and turned the room a particular amber that she'd been watching for weeks and had decided she intended to keep watching for a long time. She said, "I need to say something." He set the dish down. He turned and looked at her. She said, "I'm not grateful to you. I want to be clear about that. Gratitude is the wrong word for what this is, because gratitude implies a debt, and what you did in that alley and afterward wasn't a transaction, and I won't frame it as one." He said, "No. What I am is—" She stopped. She looked at the window, the amber light. She looked back at him. "I'm here. By choice. With my eyes open, knowing what I know about what you are, and what you're working to change, and what I am now, and what I'm still figuring out." She held his gaze. "That's what I wanted to say." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "That's enough." She said, "I know it is." Yet, the trial of Elias Carter began on a Tuesday in October, 8 months after the arraignment. Naomi was called on the 3rd day. She walked into the courtroom in a black suit and sat in the witness box and did not look at Elias Carter for the first 4 minutes, not because she was afraid to, but because she was deciding when it would be useful. And when she did look at him, she looked at him with the flat, clear attention of a woman who had finished being afraid of the thing she was looking at and was now simply seeing it accurately for the first time. She answered Raymond's questions cleanly and without embellishment. She answered the defense's cross-examination with the same quality of attention, and twice she corrected mischaracterizations with a precision that drew a visible response from the jury. Not dramatic, just the small, readable shift of people updating their understanding. The defense attorney was not Douglas Crane, who had withdrawn from the case in month 4, but a woman named Ardith Chen who was technically excellent and was working with what she had, which was not enough. Naomi was on the stand for 2.5 hours. When she stepped down, she walked out of the courtroom and into the corridor where Brianna was waiting, and Brianna put both arms around her and held on, and she let herself be held, which was something she'd gotten better at. Being held, accepting the specific weight of someone else's care without needing to qualify it or manage it, or explain to the person doing it what it meant to her. She said into her sister's shoulder, "He looks small." Brianna said, "You said that before. It keeps being true." They stood in the corridor for a minute. Then Naomi straightened and smoothed her jacket, and they walked together toward the exit. And the marble floor of the courthouse was exactly the same marble floor it had been 8 months ago on the morning of the protection order hearing, when she had stood against a wall, timing contractions, and listened to Elias say her name from a corridor behind her. And it looked different now, not because the floor had changed, but because she was looking at it from a different height. Elias Carter was convicted on 7 of the 9 counts filed against him. The sentencing hearing produced a term of 9 years, reduced from the maximum on account of partial cooperation in the later stages of the proceeding, a cooperation that his attorney had negotiated and that Elias himself had appeared to find personally humiliating in the way that men find humiliating the things they ultimately cannot avoid. She did not watch the sentencing. She was in the park with Marcus, who was 7 months old by then, and had discovered gravity in the specific way of a child who has learned to pull himself forward and cannot understand why the forward pulling keeps ending with his face against a blanket. She watched him try and fail and try again with the whole body commitment of someone for whom failure is not yet a concept, just a temporary orientation that can be corrected by renewed effort. And she thought this was probably the best lesson she'd ever witnessed delivered, and she intended to pay attention to it for a long time. Her phone buzzed. Raymond's number. She looked at it, and then she looked at Marcus, and then she put the phone back in her pocket and thought, later. She would read it later. Right now, she was watching her son discover the nature of persistence. He got his arms under him. He pushed. He lifted his head. He looked at her with an expression of complete, undisguised triumph, and she said, "Yes, exactly. That's exactly it." 6 months later, in the early spring of the following year, she and Damien and Marcus stood on the east terrace of a house they had found together. Not the original estate, which had been sold in the restructuring, but something smaller and more deliberate, on the far edge of the same county, with a view that ran east toward the hills and caught the sunrise in a way that was, on clear mornings, worth being awake for. Marcus was 13 months old. He was walking now with the specific confidence of a child who has mastered the mechanics and has not yet learned to be cautious about them, which meant he walked toward everything with the same full commitment stride regardless of terrain, and she and Damien had developed without discussing it a complementary system where one of them was always positioned to catch him. She was holding her coffee. He was standing beside her with his hand on the terrace rail, looking east, and the light was coming up slow and pale over the hills. Marcus was between them, gripping the lower rail with both hands, looking at the same light with the focused attention of someone encountering the morning as a discovery rather than a fact. She said, "Leo called yesterday?" "I know. I talked to him this morning. He said the Federal Review Board approved the second phase of the transition." "Yes." A pause. 14 months left. She looked at the light. She said, "And after that?" He said, "After that, I have about 8 things I've been thinking about. A couple of them are legitimate business ventures. One of them is something I want to show you before I say what it is." He paused. "And one of them involves a question I'm not going to ask while we're standing on a terrace at 6:30 in the morning with a 13-month-old. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the hills, not at her, with the expression he wore when he had said something that committed him to a direction and was comfortable with the commitment. She said, "You could ask it. I'll ask it when I'm ready. You seem ready. I'll ask it when I'm ready," he said again, and the corner of his mouth moved, and this time the smile arrived completely, unhurried, the full version, which she had by now seen enough times to know was the most honest thing on his face, and the thing he offered least freely, and the thing she valued most precisely because it cost him something. Marcus let go of the rail. He turned and looked up at both of them with the comprehensive interest of a child taking stock of the available world, cataloging the people in it, finding them satisfactory. He said something that was close to a word and not quite, the language still assembling itself from pieces, and then he sat down on the terrace floor with great purpose and looked at his own hands. She looked at him. She looked at the light moving across the hills, slow and even and without hurry. She looked at the man beside her, who was looking at the same light with an expression that was the composite of everything she knew about him: the control and the cost of it, the grief carried long, the capacity for violence that was real, and that he was working, methodically and without sentimentality, to build a life that did not require, and the specific and hard-won thing that had been growing underneath all of it for a year that she had stopped needing to name because it was present enough to speak for itself. She leaned her shoulder against his. He didn't move, didn't speak, just adjusted slightly so that the contact was more fully there, which was, she had learned, his language for a specific range of things he didn't say aloud. She drank her coffee. The sun came over the hills, and the light changed, and the morning opened, and every door that had led to this terrace, the ballroom, the alley, the dark estate, the courthouse corridor, the 11 hours of labor, the table conversations, the trial, and its aftermath, and the long patient work of two people deciding, day by day, what they intended to build, every door was closed now, fully, the way doors close on things that are finished. And what was left was not triumph, not the clean resolution of a story that ties itself at the end, but something realer and more durable than that. What was left was mourning. What was left was the three of them on a terrace watching the light come up. What was left was the ordinary, extraordinary fact of being alive on the other side of the thing that was supposed to finish you, and finding out, with no small astonishment, that the other side had its own particular kind of beauty, not despite what it cost to get here, but because of it, woven through it, inseparable from every scar and every choice, and every night she'd pressed her palm to her son and said, "I know," to the dark room, and meant it. Marcus looked up from his hands. He looked at the light. He said the almost word again, and this time it was close enough that she knew what he was reaching for, and she said it back to him clearly, and he looked at her with his father's eyes and his grandmother's complicated legacy and his own entirely original face, and he smiled. She held that. She let it be what it was, the morning held.